The moment. Nathaniel Crow looked at Eliza Voss and said, "You are not what I expected." Loud enough for every person on that frozen platform to hear. Something in the air changed. He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull her aside. He stood in his fine wool coat with his chin lifted and let the whole town of Blackridge watch him throw a woman away like a letter written in the wrong hand. She had traveled 9 days to get there. 9 days on trains that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, holding a wooden trunk together with one hand because the latch had broken somewhere past Billings. And this man, this wealthy, important man, looked at her tired eyes and her worn coat and decided in under 30 seconds that she wasn't enough. If that had been you standing on that platform, what would you have done? If you're watching this story and you've ever been judged before anyone gave you a chance, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if something in these first few seconds already moved you, hit that like button. Now let's go back to that platform, because what happened next is something Blackridge never forgot. The last train of the season rolled into Blackridge on the 3rd of November, 1887, and it arrived 2 hours late, which meant everyone standing on the platform had been waiting in the cold long enough to be mean about it. There were maybe 40 people gathered, ranchers and their wives, shopkeepers, a postal clerk named Abe, who never missed an arrival because the train was the most interesting thing that happened in this town, and he had long since made peace with that fact. They stood in clusters, breath rising in small clouds, boots stamping against the frozen boards. The wind came off the mountains from the northwest, and it had teeth. Nathaniel Crow stood apart from the crowd, which was how he always stood. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into something that could pass for distinguished if you didn't look too long. He wore a coat that cost more than most men in Blackridge earned in 2 months. He held his hat against the wind with one gloved hand and watched the train slow with the expression of a man conducting business, not waiting for a person. He had placed the advertisement in 4 different papers. He'd been specific about it, or so he believed. He wanted someone capable, presentable, someone who understood what it meant to be associated with a name that carried weight in this territory. His ranch covered 11,000 acres. His cattle operation was the largest between here and the Canadian border. He had 2 children who needed structure and a household that needed managing, and he had been running both on stubbornness and hired help for 3 years since Margaret died, and it was not working. He had received 14 letters in response to his advertisement. He'd chosen Eliza Voss's because her handwriting was steady, and her sentences were direct, and she hadn't tried to make herself sound like something she wasn't. She had written, "I am not a delicate woman. I have worked hard ground in hard weather, and I do not expect comfort to come before effort." That sentence had struck him as honest. He'd written back and made an offer, and she had accepted. He had not asked for a portrait. That was his first miscalculation. The train stopped, and the passengers came out in the usual disorder. Men with bags, a family with too many children, a traveling salesman Nathaniel recognized from 2 seasons prior. Then she appeared at the top of the steps. She was perhaps 35, maybe younger. It was difficult to tell because the cold had put color in her cheeks that could have been youth or could have been windburn. She was not tall. She was not the kind of woman who entered a space and made it rearrange itself around her. She wore a dark coat that had been mended at both elbows and a wool scarf the color of old rust. She carried a trunk that was clearly heavy and was managing it by leaning her whole body into the effort. In her other hand she held, improbably, a black iron pot, the kind your grandmother's grandmother might have used, the kind that had cooked 10,000 meals and showed every one of them on its surface. She stepped down onto the platform and looked around with the careful eyes of someone who had learned that rooms, like people, required assessment before trust. Nathaniel walked toward her. The crowd shifted without meaning to, the way crowds do when something is about to happen. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Crow." She set the trunk down and extended her hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were steady. They were gray-green, the kind of color that changed depending on the light. And then he looked at her, really looked, and his expression did what it did. It closed. Not slowly, not with any attempt at diplomacy. It simply shut, the way a door shuts when someone decides the conversation is over. "You are not what I expected," his voice carried. That was the thing nobody who wasn't there could understand afterward, how far that sentence traveled in the cold air. Abe the postal clerk heard it. The rancher's wife near the far end of the platform heard it. 3 of Nathaniel's own ranch hands, who had come with the wagon, heard it clearly enough that 2 of them looked at their boots. Eliza did not flinch, but she went very still. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I needed someone who could stand beside my family name." He said it quietly now, as if lowering his voice made it more reasonable. Someone who presented herself accordingly, not someone who... He stopped, looked at the pot, looked at the mended coat. Not someone carrying a lifetime of hardship. There was a long silence. The wind moved through it. "I see," Eliza said. That was all she said, 2 words. And then she picked up her trunk again, both hands now, the pot balanced on top of it somehow. And she stepped to the side of the platform, out of the flow of people, and stood there alone. Nathaniel walked back to his wagon. His ranch hands didn't say anything. Nobody said anything out loud. But the whispers started before he'd gone 10 steps, moving through the crowd like smoke finding gaps in a wall. "Did you hear that? Did you see what he said to her? Poor thing. Came all this way. Well, what did she expect? A man like Crow isn't going to take in just anyone. And underneath the sympathy, threaded through it like wire through cloth, she should have known better. She should have known. Eliza heard none of it, or perhaps she heard all of it. She stood at the edge of the platform and looked out at the town. The single main street, the gray storefronts, the mountains in the distance wearing their early snow like something permanent. And her face was very difficult to read. She was calculating. Anyone who knew her would have recognized it. She wasn't falling apart. She was taking inventory. The boarding house was 3 blocks up the main street. She had $7.40 in a small envelope inside the trunk. She had enough food to last maybe 2 days if she was careful. The storm that had been building all morning was going to come down hard before nightfall. She could feel it in the way the air had gotten heavy and still, the way the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees in the last hour, even with the wind. She was working through the arithmetic of a situation that didn't have a good answer when she heard the sound. It was a small sound, barely anything. The kind of sound you'd miss if your own thoughts were loud enough. She turned. A boy, maybe 7 years old, had pressed himself against the station wall just around the corner from the main platform. He was wearing a coat that was too thin for this weather, wool gone threadbare at the collar, buttons mismatched where someone had replaced them in a hurry. His hands were shoved into his pockets. His ears were red. Not the healthy red of a child who'd been running, but the dull, painful red of a child who'd been cold for a long time and had stopped thinking much about it. He wasn't crying. That was what got her. I was just standing there the way children stand when they've learned that no one is coming. Eliza walked over to him. "What's your name?" she said. He looked up. He had dark eyes, the kind that take everything in. "Danny. Danny, are you waiting for someone?" "My ma's inside getting a package." He paused. "She said, wait here. I've been waiting." "I can see that." She looked at his ears, his hands. "How long have you been out here?" He thought about it. Since the train came. The train had been on the platform for 20 minutes. In this temperature, with that coat, 20 minutes was too long. Eliza unwound the scarf from her own neck. She shook it out once and wrapped it around Danny's head and ears, tucking the ends into his collar. He let her do it with the trusting passivity of a child who was too cold to question anything. "There," she said. "Better?" He nodded. "Good." She gave his shoulder a brief, brisk pat and straightened up. She hadn't done it for an audience. She hadn't looked around to see who was watching. She just did it the same way you'd close a window that was letting in cold air, because it needed doing, and she was there. But people had seen. Abe the postal clerk saw it. 2 of the ranchers' wives saw it. And one of Nathaniel Crow's ranch hands, a quiet man named Webb, who had been working the Crow property for 11 years and had seen a great many things in that time, stood by the wagon and watched Eliza Voss give away her only protection against the cold to a stranger's child, and he filed it away somewhere behind his eyes. The boy's mother came rushing out of the station a minute later, flustered and apologetic, and swept Danny up with relief. She noticed the scarf and looked around, confused, and Danny pointed at Eliza. The woman started to say something, thank you probably, or some version of it, but Eliza had already turned back toward the street, trunk in both hands again, heading toward town. The storm came down at 4 o'clock. By 5, the road north out of Blackridge was impassable. The mail rider said the drifts were already knee-deep on the low road, and the temperature was still dropping. The train that had been scheduled to continue east turned back to wait at the junction. There was no leaving Blackridge that night, possibly for several nights. Eliza stood in the small lobby of Hendrick's boarding house and listened to Martha Hendricks explain that there were no rooms available at any price because of the storm. Every bed was spoken for, and she was sorry, but there was simply nothing to be done. "I understand," Eliza said. "Thank you for telling me." She picked up her trunk. "Where will you go?" Martha Hendricks asked, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who felt guilty, but not guilty enough to actually do anything about it. "I'll sort something out," Eliza said. She went back out into the storm. The wind hit her full in the face, and she stood there for a moment on the boarding house steps, letting her eyes adjust. The snow was coming sideways now. The street was already difficult to see. The temperature had an edge to it that went past uncomfortable into something that required attention. She had $7.40 and a pot and a trunk and no scarf. She looked up the street, then down the street. She found the general store, which was still lit, and went inside. The owner, a thin man named Grady, who wore his suspenders too tight and had the look of someone perpetually trying to prevent small disasters, watched her come in with the careful neutrality of a man who hadn't decided yet whether she was a customer or a problem. She bought 2 tins of beans, a small paper of salt pork, and a box of matches. That left her $6.12. She asked Grady if he knew of anywhere she might shelter for the night. He thought about it for longer than was comfortable. Then he said there was the old feed shed at the back of the livery, and the livery owner sometimes let travelers use it in bad weather if they didn't mind the smell. "I don't mind the smell," Eliza said. She thanked him and went back out. She was halfway to the livery when she heard the boots. Not running, walking, deliberate. The kind of walk that means someone has made a decision and is committed to it. She turned. Nathaniel Crow was coming down the street toward her, his coat collar turned up against the snow, his expression unreadable. One of his ranch hands, the quiet one, Webb, was a few steps behind him. She stopped walking. She did not put the trunk down. He stopped about 4 feet away. The snow came down between them. "I owe you an apology," he said. "No," she said. "You were honest. Most people aren't." That stopped him. He hadn't expected that. "What I said was true," she said. "I am carrying a lifetime of hardship. I don't see the point in pretending otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind pushed at both of them. "The roads are closed," he said finally. "I'm aware." "The boarding house is full." Also aware. "I have a ranch house with 12 rooms, 3 of which are currently empty." She looked at him steadily. "What are you asking?" "I'm offering you shelter until the roads open," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less." "And in return?" He seemed slightly thrown by the question. Most people, she imagined, would not have asked it. Most people in her position would have simply said yes before he finished the sentence. "My household has been without proper management for 3 years," he said carefully. "My children have been without someone consistent, someone who knows how to run a home." "You want me to work?" "I want you to do what you said in your letter you could do." He paused. "I should not have dismissed you on the platform. That was poorly done." It was not quite an apology, but it was as close as she suspected this man came to one. She thought about the feed shed. She thought about her $6. She thought about the trunk and the pot and the 9 days on the train and the way his face had closed when he looked at her coat. "I'll earn my keep," she said, "but I want that understood from the beginning. I'm not accepting charity." "I didn't offer charity," he said. "I offered a position." "Then we understand each other." He nodded once, the way men like him nod when something has been settled. Webb came forward and took the trunk without being asked, lifting it like it weighed nothing. He didn't say anything. He just carried it to the wagon. Eliza followed, her pot in hand, the snow working its way into the collar of her coatless neck. The drive out to the Crow Ranch took 40 minutes on a good day. In this storm, it took closer to 2 hours. They sat in the wagon bed, Eliza and Webb, and another hand whose name she didn't catch, under a canvas that did most of the work of keeping the snow off. Nathaniel rode up front, handling the horses himself, which surprised her. She'd expected him to have someone else do it. She didn't speak much on the drive. She watched the land go by through a gap in the canvas, or what she could see of it through the snow, which was mostly just the shapes of things, hills and fence lines and the occasional dark mass of trees. The territory was enormous. She'd known that in the abstract, the way you know something from a map, but sitting in a wagon moving through it was different. It made you feel the scale of the emptiness. "You warm enough?" Webb asked at some point. "I'm fine," she said. "We got a blanket somewhere back here." "I'm fine," she said again, and he let it go. She wasn't fine, particularly. The cold was serious now, working into her fingers and settling into the joints of her knees. But she'd been colder than this before, and she had learned a long time ago that complaining about temperature-used energy better spent on staying warm. So she tucked her hands under her arms and watched the dark shapes of the frontier move past, and thought about what she'd find when they arrived. What she found was a house, not the word she would have chosen, standing in front of it. It was a proper structure, 2 stories, solid construction, enough windows on the front face to let in a reasonable amount of light in better weather. Someone had built it to last, which meant someone had cared about it once. But the care had been let go. The front steps had a broken board, badly patched. The lamp above the door was the kind that needed regular attention and hadn't gotten any. The window on the east side had a crack in it stuffed with what looked like cloth. These were not the failings of poverty. These were the failings of a house that had stopped being watched. Inside was warmer, which was something. A fire had been kept going in the main room. The kitchen was large, genuinely large, with a good iron range and a proper work table. But it had the smell of a space used mostly for necessity rather than effort. Meals made because people had to eat, not because anyone took any care about it. 2 faces appeared at the top of the staircase. A boy, maybe 14. Dark-haired, with his father's jaw and his father's expression, which was to say that his face was already working very hard at not showing anything. And below him, smaller, a girl who might have been 8 or 9. She had lighter hair and very large eyes, and she stood 1 step behind her brother with both hands on the railing, looking down at Eliza with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite hope. Something in between. "Ethan," Nathaniel said. "Evelyn, come down." They came. Slowly. Ethan first, taking each step with the deliberate care of someone expecting an ambush. Evelyn followed, one hand still trailing on the railing. They stood in the hallway and looked at Eliza. "This is Miss Voss," Nathaniel said. "She'll be staying with us for a time." "How long?" Ethan asked. His voice had the edge of someone asking a question they don't really want answered. "We'll see," Nathaniel said. Ethan looked at Eliza. He did not offer a hand. He did not smile. He looked at her the way she'd seen men look at things they weren't sure were worth their attention. Eliza met his gaze evenly. "I'm not here to replace anyone," she said. It was a thing she'd thought about on the wagon ride, how to say it, whether to say it at all. She'd decided it was better said than left to assumption. "I'm here because the storm closed the roads, and your father offered me a place to wait it out. That's all." Ethan didn't say anything. Evelyn, from behind her brother's shoulder, said very quietly, "You don't have a scarf." "I gave it away," Eliza said. Evelyn looked at her. "To who?" "A boy at the station. He was cold." Evelyn thought about this for a moment. Then she disappeared back up the stairs and returned a minute later with a gray wool scarf, which she held out over the railing toward Eliza. "You can use this one," she said. "It was my mother's. She doesn't need it anymore." The hallway went very quiet. Nathaniel made a small sound that was not quite a word. Ethan looked at the floor. Eliza reached up and took the scarf carefully, with both hands, the way you take something that matters. "Thank you," she said. "I'll take good care of it." Evelyn nodded seriously. Then she went back upstairs. Ethan followed without speaking. Nathaniel stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the space where his children had been. Then he cleared his throat. "The room at the end of the east hall is yours," he said. "Supper is usually—" He stopped. "We usually manage something around 6. "I'll make supper," Eliza said. He looked at her. "You've been traveling," he said. "I've been sitting in a wagon," she said. "That's not the same thing, and I expect your kitchen has whatever I need, unless you'd rather I didn't." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "No. Do what you think is best." He went into his study and closed the door. Eliza stood in the hallway alone and looked at the kitchen door. She could hear the storm outside, working at the windows, looking for gaps. She went to the kitchen. It was worse than she'd expected in some ways, better in others. The range was genuinely good, a proper cast iron, well made, and someone had kept it clean even if they hadn't done much else. The pantry had enough: dried beans, a side of salt pork, flour, lard, some root vegetables that were soft but still usable, a half wheel of cheese. Not wealth, but enough. She found a pot, not her pot, one of the kitchen's, and started the beans soaking and got the range going properly and found an onion behind the flour sack and started cutting it. Her hands were still cold. She cut slowly until the feeling came back. Webb appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said. "I know," she said. He watched her cut for a moment. "He's not a bad man," Webb said. "What he said on the platform, that wasn't—" He stopped, choosing words. "He's had a hard few years." "Most people have," Eliza said. Webb made a sound that might have been agreement. "He doesn't know how to ask for help, never did. But he came back for you. That's—" He paused again. "That's not nothing for him." "I know that too," she said. He nodded and left. She cooked the meal slowly, letting the beans go as long as they needed, adding the salt pork in stages, seasoning it the way her mother had taught her, carefully, building layers, tasting as she went. She made biscuits from the flour and lard, rolling them on the work table. She found a jar of preserved apples at the back of the pantry and warmed them with a little of the cheese grated over the top. It was not a fancy meal, but it was real. It was made with attention, and when she called it ready, knocking on the study door, then going to the foot of the stairs and calling up, something happened that she suspected hadn't happened in this house in a long time. They all came to the table. Nathaniel came out of his study. Ethan came down with his arms crossed and his expression closed. Evelyn came down with her serious eyes and sat beside her brother and watched Eliza set the bowls out. Nobody said anything for a moment, then Evelyn picked up her spoon and tried the beans. Her expression shifted. It was small, the particular shift of a child who was expecting one thing and got another. "It's good," she said, as if this was information someone needed. Ethan took a bite. His expression did not shift, but he kept eating, which was something. Nathaniel ate in silence. He was 2/3 through his bowl before he looked up. "This is from the pantry," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Everything in it," she said. He looked back at his bowl. "We had the same things last week," he said. "It didn't taste like this." She didn't answer that because there wasn't really an answer that didn't sound like showing off, and showing off was not what she was here for. After supper, Evelyn helped clear the bowls without being asked, stacking them carefully beside the dry sink. Ethan disappeared. Nathaniel went back to his study. Eliza washed the dishes herself, slowly, her back aching from the travel and the cold. The storm was still going outside. She could hear it working at the corners of the house, pressing and retreating and pressing again. When she was done, she dried her hands and looked around the kitchen. It was clean now, not transformed, not perfect, just clean. She went to the east hall and found the room that was hers and stood in it for a moment. There was a narrow bed, a chest, a small window. Through the window, she could see nothing, just the dark and the snow coming sideways. She sat on the edge of the bed with the gray scarf in her lap. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had lost things that would have broken other people, and she had not fallen apart. And she was not about to fall apart now, in a cold room in a ranch house in Montana, in the worst storm of the season. That was not who she was. But she sat there with her hands wrapped around the scarf, and she breathed slowly for a few minutes, and she let herself feel the full weight of the day. The platform, the cold, the trunk, the way his voice had carried when he said those words. The little girl holding out her dead mother's scarf over a railing to a stranger. She let herself feel it, and then she folded the scarf carefully and set it on the chest and lay down in her clothes because she was too tired to do otherwise. And she listened to the storm, and she thought about the kitchen and the pantry and what could be done with what was there. Because that was the thing about hardship. It taught you to see what was actually in front of you instead of what you wished was there. There was enough here. In this house, in this broken family, in this storm-locked territory at the edge of the world, there was enough to work with. She closed her eyes. Outside, the storm continued its work. But inside the Crow Ranch house, for the first time in 3 years, the kitchen had been used the way a kitchen was meant to be used, with purpose, with patience, with the quiet insistence that the people inside a house deserved a meal that tasted like someone had given it thought. That was where Eliza Voss started. Not with grand gestures, with beans and biscuits and a pot of preserved apples, and the storm pressing against the windows, and the gray scarf on the chest, and the sound of a house that was slowly, very slowly, remembering it was a home. She was already awake when the ranch house began to stir. Not because something woke her. There had been no sound, no particular disturbance. She had simply reached the end of sleep the way you reach the end of a road, and her eyes had opened into the dark. And that was that. The window above the chest showed a gray that was not yet morning, but was no longer fully night. The storm had settled overnight into something quieter and more serious. Not the violent throwing of snow she'd fallen asleep to, but a steady, patient accumulation that had no interest in stopping. She lay still for a moment and took stock of where she was, which was a habit she'd developed over years of waking in unfamiliar places. East Hall. Narrow bed. Crow Ranch, 11,000 acres. Montana Territory. November. 2 children at the top of the stairs, one of them angry and one of them watching. A man who had humiliated her on a public platform and then come out into a blizzard to offer her a room, which meant he was either guilty or practical or some combination of both. A house that had stopped functioning as a house somewhere around 3 years ago, by her estimation. She got up. The kitchen was cold. The range had banked low overnight, and the first thing she did was get it going again. This required some coaxing. Someone had let the airflow get restricted, which was a beginner's mistake that someone had apparently been making for long enough that it had become the normal way of things. She adjusted the damper, cleared the ash that had built up where it shouldn't, and got the fire going properly. It took about 12 minutes. By the end of it, her hands were gray with ash, and her back ached from crouching, but the range was drawing correctly and would hold heat now without fighting itself. She put water on for coffee. Then she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the ranch in the early morning. The snow had buried most of the yard to mid-fence height. The barn was visible, barely, a dark shape against the white, with a thin line of smoke from whatever heating system they used for the livestock. There were tracks in the yard, boot prints already, which meant someone had been up before her. She guessed Webb. He had the look of a man who treated sleep as a minor inconvenience. She could see from the kitchen window 3 things that needed addressing. The barn door was hanging slightly wrong on one hinge. She could tell from the way it sat crooked in its frame. The water pump in the yard had no insulating wrap on the pipe, which in this temperature meant it was probably already frozen and would need to be thawed before any water came from it. And the feed distribution system, she could see the chute arrangement from here, was set up in a way that would mean extra labor in heavy snow conditions, labor that could be avoided with a simple repositioning. She filed all of this without deciding what to do about it yet. It was not her ranch. She had been here for one night, but she filed it. The coffee was ready when she heard the first footstep on the stairs. Not Nathaniel's heavy tread. Lighter. She didn't turn around. "You're up early," Evelyn said from the doorway. "So are you," Eliza said. A pause. Then small feet on the kitchen floor. Evelyn appeared at the edge of the work table and pulled herself up onto the stool that sat beside it, which was clearly a habitual position. She settled into it with the ease of someone reclaiming their spot. "I'm usually up early," Evelyn said. "Ethan says I'm annoying because of it." "Your brother gets up late?" "He gets up when he wants to. Papa doesn't say anything about it." She paused. "He didn't used to. Before? He used to make Ethan get up for chores." Eliza poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the work table. Then she thought about it and added a small amount from the water pot to cool it and pushed it toward Evelyn. The girl looked at it, then up at Eliza. "That's for me?" "Unless there's someone else at the table." Evelyn wrapped both hands around the cup and took a careful sip. Her expression did the small shift again, the one that meant something was different from what she'd expected. "We used to have coffee in the mornings," she said. "Before." Eliza began pulling together what she needed for breakfast. She didn't ask what before meant. She already knew. "What do you usually have for breakfast?" she asked instead. Evelyn thought about it. Bread sometimes, or eggs when Webb collects them. Sometimes it's just whatever's left from the night before. "What would you want?" if you could have anything. Evelyn considered this with the seriousness of someone who didn't often get asked that question. Porridge, she said finally, with the brown sugar. My mother used to make it with the brown sugar and some of the dried apple. Do you have oats in the pantry? I think so, at the back, behind the beans. Eliza found them, a cloth sack, half full, the oats still good. She found the brown sugar, hardened into a block that needed working with the back of a spoon, and a small collection of the same dried apple she'd used the night before. She made the porridge. Evelyn sat on her stool and watched every step of it with the focused attention of someone trying to memorize a procedure, and Eliza let her watch without commentary, because some things you learn better by watching than by being told. When it was done, Eliza set a bowl in front of her. Evelyn ate a spoonful. Then she stopped. It tastes like hers, she said, very quietly. Eliza kept her voice neutral. Different people make it different ways. I don't know how your mother made it. It still tastes like hers. There was a long silence. Evelyn looked at her bowl. She was not crying. She had the look of a child who had moved past the kind of grief that cries and into the kind that just sits there like a stone in the chest. Is that all right? Eliza asked. Or would you rather I made something different? Evelyn looked up. No, she said. It's all right. She finished the bowl. Ethan appeared at 9 o'clock, long after his sister had gone back upstairs to dress. He came into the kitchen with his coat already on, clearly intending to pass through rather than stay, and stopped when he found Eliza reorganizing the pantry shelf, which she had taken down to the floor and was putting back in a different order, one that made sense for how a kitchen was actually used. He looked at the scattered tins and sacks on the kitchen floor. What are you doing? He said. The pantry was organized by whoever unpacked it last, she said. They put the daily use items in the back and the specialty things in the front. You have to move 6 things to get to the flour. It's been like that for 2 years. That explains why the biscuits last night took longer to put together than they should have. She looked up at him. It's not a criticism. Nobody noticed because it's small, but small things add up. Ethan stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. He was doing the thing with his face, keeping it closed, keeping her out. She recognized it. She'd seen it on grown men who'd been at it for 40 years. You're reorganizing our house, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it was close. I'm reorganizing a shelf, she said. I'll put it back if you'd rather. He looked at the tins on the floor. Why do you even care? You'll be gone when the roads open. She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. Probably, she said. But the shelf will still be there after I'm gone, and whoever uses this kitchen next will either have it in an order that makes sense or one that doesn't. Seems worth the 20 minutes. He didn't have a response to that. He stood for a moment longer, then went out through the back door into the cold without saying anything else. Eliza watched the door close. Then she turned back to the shelf. She wasn't going to win that boy over quickly. That was fine. Quick was for people who had something to prove. She had nothing to prove. She was putting back a pantry shelf in a cold kitchen in a snowstorm, and that was exactly what the moment required, and she intended to do it correctly. Nathaniel appeared mid-morning, coming from the direction of the barn, with snow on his coat and a look on his face that meant something had gone wrong. The water pump is frozen, he said, standing in the kitchen doorway. I saw that from the window this morning, she said. The pipe has no wrap on it. He looked at her. You saw it from the window. There was enough light by 7 to see the yard. He rubbed the back of his neck. We've been hauling water from the barn since yesterday. We have enough for the livestock, but the house supply is going to be a problem. Do you have burlap sacking in the barn? Somewhere. And something to bind it with? Wire or cord? Both. Then the pump can be thawed today and wrapped so it doesn't refreeze. It's not a complicated job. It just needs doing before the temperature drops again tonight. He looked at her for a moment. You've done this before. My family ran a farm until I was 23, she said. We had winters in Wisconsin that would make this one seem polite. Something moved in his expression. Not quite respect, not yet, but the precursor to it. The moment when a person revises upward an estimate they'd set too low. I'll have Webb do the pump, he said. I can help him. I know how to do it. You don't need to. I know I don't need to, she said. But Webb is one man and there are 3 things wrong with the barn setup I can see from here, and none of them are going to fix themselves. and my hands work as well as his. Another pause. He was not a man who was accustomed to being met with this kind of directness, particularly from someone in a position he considered dependent. She could see him deciding how to respond. "All right," he said. "I'll tell him you're coming out." She put on every layer she had and borrowed a pair of heavy work gloves from the peg by the back door. They were too large, a man's gloves, but she tucked the fingers and they held, and went out into the yard. The cold was serious. Not the worst she'd experienced, but serious. The snow was shin-deep in the open areas and deeper where it had drifted against structures. She moved through it carefully, testing each step. Webb was already at the pump with a pail of warm water and a length of straw. He looked up when she came across the yard. "He said you were coming," Webb said. "Do you have the burlap?" "Inside the barn." He nodded toward it. "You sure you want to be out here? It's—" "Webb," she said, not unkindly. "I'm from Wisconsin." He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face eased, just slightly. "All right," he said. "Let's get the pump." They worked through the morning, thawing the pump pipe by stages, applying the warm water carefully so the expansion didn't crack anything, then wrapping the exposed sections in burlap and binding it tight. It was fiddly work and heavy gloves, and her fingers ached by the time they were done, but the pump drew water when they primed it, and the wrap would hold through tonight if the temperature didn't go below what it had been last night. While they worked, Webb talked. Not much, and not in the way of someone trying to fill silence. He talked the way people talk when they've been somewhere long enough to know its history. In pieces, factual, without sentiment. The ranch had been built by Nathaniel and his wife Margaret together, starting from almost nothing. That was the thing most people in Black Ridge didn't fully understand. They saw what it was now and assumed it had always been this way. It hadn't. The first winter, Nathaniel and Margaret had lived in a two-room structure that would have fit inside the current kitchen. Margaret had worked beside him for 15 years before the house became what it was. She knew this ranch as well as he did, Webb said, binding the burlap at the joint. Maybe better. She knew where the weak spots were. "What happened?" Eliza asked. "Fever, winter of '84. He pulled the binding tight. She was sick 4 days and gone on the 5th. Nathaniel—" He stopped. "He's not a man who knows how to be undone, so he wasn't, publicly." "And privately?" Webb looked at her. "He stopped seeing the weak spots," he said. "That's the best way I can put it. He kept the cattle operation going because he could do that in his sleep. But the house—" He shook his head. "The house just started coming apart, slow." Eliza looked at the pump, at the burlap wrap. "And the children." "Ethan was 11 when she died. He was—" Webb paused. "He was a different boy before, more open. He and his father used to argue because Ethan had opinions about everything, and he'd say them out loud and Nathaniel would push back, and it was a real family. You know what I mean, the kind where people fight sometimes. And now? Now they don't fight, they just—" He gestured vaguely. "Occupy the same space." Eliza thought about that. "And Evelyn?" "She was 5 when her mother died. She doesn't remember enough to miss the specific things. She just misses—" He stopped again, looking for the word. "The shape of it. The way things used to feel." The pump handle moved freely now. The water came up clear and cold. "She gave me her mother's scarf last night," Eliza said. Webb was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I heard about it." Was that something she did impulsively, or is she's a child who has too much of her mother's things and no one to give them to," Webb said simply. "She's been looking for somewhere to put them." They carried the tools back to the barn. Eliza spent another hour in there because once she was inside, she could see the feed situation clearly, and it was worse than she'd thought. Not dangerous yet, but heading that way if the storm continued. The distribution wasn't working efficiently. They were using more feed per animal than they needed to because of how it was being moved, and in a long storm that kind of waste added up toward a problem. She rearranged the feed storage, not dramatically, just shifted 3 elements of the process to remove a redundant step. And Webb watched her do it and then said, very quietly, "Huh." "What?" she said. "Margaret did something similar," he said. "First winter she was here. Moved the whole east side of the feed system." Eliza stopped. "I'm not trying to be her," she said. "I know that," Webb said. "I wasn't suggesting you were." He picked up a shovel and started clearing the aisle. "I was just—" He paused. noticing. She went back to the house at noon, half frozen and hungry, and made soup from the stock she'd started that morning. The bones from last night's salt pork, some of the root vegetables, a fistful of dried herbs from the bunch she'd found hanging in the pantry that nobody had used since they'd been put up. Ethan came in from somewhere. She didn't know where he'd been all morning and didn't ask, and stood at the stove warming his hands and smelled the soup. "What's in it?" he said. "What was available?" she said. He was quiet. She ladled him a bowl without asking and set it on the table and went back to what she was doing. He stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether accepting the soup meant something, and then sat down and ate it. When he was done, he didn't say anything, but he put the bowl beside the dry sink instead of leaving it on the table, which meant he'd noticed where the used dishes went. Small things. Nathaniel came in at mid-afternoon with the look of a man who had been managing problems since before dawn and had not reached the end of them. He sat at the kitchen table, not his usual place. She was learning he usually took his meals in his study, and accepted a cup of coffee and held it in both hands and looked at nothing in particular. "The South Herd is going to need moving tomorrow if this keeps up," he said. It wasn't really directed at her. He was thinking out loud. "Where are they now?" He looked up as if remembering she was there. "Lower pasture, south fence. If the snow gets deeper, they won't be able to reach the grass." "Can they be moved to the winter pasture?" "That's the plan, but the winter pasture gate has been frozen shut since yesterday, and 3 of my hands are down with the same cough Abe Jenkins had last week." She thought about it. "How many do you need to move the herd?" "Typically 4. I can do it with 3 if they're good." "I can ride," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not putting you on a horse in this weather," he said. "I didn't ask for permission," she said. "I told you I can ride. Whether you use that or not is your decision." The silence between them had a texture to it. She could feel him trying to categorize her, trying to find the slot in his understanding of people where she belonged, and failing to find one that fit. "You said you ran a farm," he said. "Until I was 23. "What happened at 23? She looked at him steadily. "My parents died. The farm went to pay the debts. I worked in a hotel kitchen in Milwaukee for 4 years, then a boarding house in St. Paul for 3. Then I came here." He absorbed this. "You've been working since you were 23. "Since I was 12, actually, but harder after 23. Another silence, different from the others. She watched him absorb this version of her, the version that had history and weight, instead of the one he'd seen on the platform. The worn coat, the mended sleeves, the pot. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said on the platform." "You apologized already." "I said I owed you one. I didn't actually say it." She considered this. It was the kind of distinction a man made when he took words seriously, which was either admirable or annoying depending on the circumstance. In this circumstance, she decided it was admirable. "All right," she said. "Apology accepted." He nodded, looked at his coffee. "Why did you put the advertisement in the paper?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I told you, the household—" "You told me the practical reason," she said. "But a man like you has options. You could have hired any number of housekeepers in Blackridge. You didn't need to put an advertisement in 4 different papers." He looked at her sharply. "How do you know it was 4 papers?" "It was in the Billings Gazette, the Helena Independent, the Butte Miner, and the Chicago Tribune," she said. "I found all 4 of them through a reference in a boarding house in St. Paul. Most men running a household advertisement don't go that wide unless they're looking for something specific." He was quiet. "What were you looking for?" she asked. He stood up and took his coffee cup to the dry sink and stood with his back to her for a moment. "Someone who wouldn't leave when it got hard," he said finally. "Everyone I hired locally. They stayed 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Then they went back to town. It's a difficult property. It's isolated. The children—" He stopped. "Ethan's not easy." "He's grieving," she said. "He's been grieving for 3 years. "Some grief takes 3 years," she said. "Some takes longer. Putting a time limit on it doesn't make it move faster. It just makes the person feel like they're doing it wrong." He turned and looked at her. "You sound like you know something about it," he said. "I lost both parents inside 6 months," she said. "I know something about it." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the storm pressed against the kitchen window. A gust came through that rattled the frame and then passed. Ethan won't talk to me, he said. It came out differently from his other statements. Lower, as if he'd been holding it for a while. He used to, before. He'd argue with me about everything. Cattle prices, fence placement, which road to take into town. I told him he was too opinionated. I told him he needed to learn when to be quiet. He stopped. Now he's quiet all the time, and I don't know what to do with it. Eliza said nothing for a moment. She was aware that this was not a confession this man made easily, possibly ever. Tell him you were wrong about the quiet, she said. He blinked. What? Tell him you were wrong, that you want the arguments back, that a boy who has opinions is better than a boy who's given up on being heard. She paused. He's not quiet because he learned when to be quiet. He's quiet because he decided you didn't want to hear him. The kitchen was very still. Nathaniel stood with his coffee cup and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, I don't know how to start that conversation. You just had most of it with me, she said. Start the same way. Tell him the truth. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between discomfort and something else. Something that was not quite gratitude and not quite respect, but was in the neighborhood of both. You're not what I expected, he said. You've said that before. This time it means something different. She didn't answer that. She went back to the soup. That evening, something happened that she didn't fully understand until later. Ethan came into the kitchen after supper and stood near the window for a while, looking out at the dark and the snow. She was washing the dishes. She didn't say anything to him. After a while he said, Webb says you fixed the feed system. I adjusted it, she said. Webb did the work. He says you knew what was wrong without being told. I grew up around livestock, she said. Another silence. She kept washing. My mother used to spend time in the barn, Ethan said. More than my father thought she should. He'd tell her it was the hands' job, and she'd tell him the hands didn't know the animals the way she did. Was she right? Yeah, he said. She was usually right. Eliza set a bowl in the drain rack. She sounds like she was capable, she said. She was. He paused. I'm not saying you're like her. You're like her. You're not. You're different. I know I'm different. He stopped, started again. I'm just saying she would have fixed the feed system too. She would have seen it. She looked at him. He was still facing the window. Thank you, she said, for telling me that. He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. He stood at the window for another few minutes, and then he went upstairs, and it was the longest he'd voluntarily stayed in the same room with her since she'd arrived. Eliza dried her hands and put out the kitchen lamp and stood in the dark kitchen for a moment, listening. The storm had changed pitch. It was lower now, deeper, the sustained roar of a storm that had settled in for the long work rather than the sharp violence of the first night. She'd heard that sound before. It meant days, not hours. She thought about the south herd in the lower pasture, about the frozen gate, about 3 hands sick with a cough and 4 needed to move cattle. She thought about Evelyn, who gave away her mother's things to strangers because she had no one to give them to. About Ethan, who went quiet when the person he wanted to hear him stopped listening. About Nathaniel, who had advertised across 4 states for someone who wouldn't leave when it got hard. She thought about the pump, wrapped now in burlap, doing its job in the cold. She went to the East Hall and got into bed and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch work against the storm, creak by creak, and thought about what a house needed to survive a winter that wasn't going to be polite about how long it stayed. It needed maintenance. It needed attention. It needed someone to notice the small things before they became large ones. She had noticed. She had always noticed. Whether or not that mattered here was still to be determined. But outside the storm was settling in for the long work. And inside the Crow Ranch house, the kitchen was clean, and the pump was wrapped, and the soup pot was empty. And in 3 different rooms, 3 people who had been living in proximity without really occupying the same world were lying in their beds thinking about the woman in the East Hall who had come to them with nothing but a pot and a trunk and hands that knew how to fix what was broken. None of them said so, but they thought it, and in the morning she would be there again, and the range would be drawing correctly, and the coffee would be ready, and the day would begin again with whatever the storm brought next. That was all she'd promised. But it was turning out to be more than they'd had in a long time. The storm did not leave in the morning. It did not leave the morning after that either. By the 4th day, the snow had buried the lower fence rails completely, and the drifts along the north side of the barn had climbed past the first window. The temperature had dropped another 6 degrees overnight and showed no interest in recovering. Webb came in at breakfast with ice in his beard and the careful expression of a man choosing which problems to report first. "South herd," he said, standing at the kitchen door with his coat still on. "We need to move them today. The pasture grass has gone under. They've been standing at the fence." Nathaniel looked up from his coffee. He hadn't slept well. Eliza could tell from the set of his jaw, the particular stillness around his eyes. "How many hands do we have?" "Myself and Cutter. Dolan's fever broke last night, but he's weak. Rourke's still bad. That's 3. 2.5, Webb said. "Dolan shouldn't be on a horse." Nathaniel set down his cup. "I'll ride." "That makes 3. "I said I could ride," Eliza said from the stove. Both men looked at her. "You said that 4 days ago," Nathaniel said. "I've been thinking about it." "And?" He looked at Webb. Webb looked at the ceiling, which was his way of staying out of things. "Can you work cattle?" Nathaniel asked her. "I've worked cattle," she said. "Not 11,000 acres worth, but I understand the principles." "It's not the principles I'm worried about. It's the conditions." "The conditions are what they are," she said. "You need 4 riders. You have 3.5. I'm offering to be the 4th. Another silence. Webb was still studying the ceiling. "All right," Nathaniel said. He didn't sound happy about it. He sounded like a man who had run the numbers and come up with the same answer she had. "But you ride behind Cutter and you do what he says. He knows the south pasture." "Fine," she said. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway, still pulling on his second glove. "I'm coming too." Nathaniel looked at his son. Ethan looked back, not with the closed, armored expression he'd worn all week, but with something more direct, something that wanted to be taken seriously. "You're 14, Nathaniel said. "I know how to ride. I've worked cattle with Webb since I was 10. "The conditions are what they are," Ethan said, using Eliza's words back at his father. He said it without looking at her, but she saw the corner of his mouth move. Nathaniel considered his son for a long moment. Something was happening between them. Not resolution, nothing that clean, but a crack in the wall, small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. "Stay with Webb," Nathaniel said finally. "You listen to him." "I always listen to Webb." "No, you don't." "I listen to him more than I listen to you." Webb made a sound that might have been a cough. Nathaniel looked at his son for another moment. Then he said, "Ride left of Webb. Don't push the lead animals too fast in the deep snow. They'll tire." Ethan nodded. And the thing that passed between them, brief, incomplete, nothing like what it needed to eventually become, was at least something. The first exchange they'd had in months that sounded like a father and son talking about a real thing instead of performing a version of it. Eliza noted it and said nothing. She borrowed a heavier coat from the peg by the back door. It was enormous on her, a man's coat, probably an old one of Nathaniel's from the look of it, and pulled her gloves on and went to the barn to get the horses ready. What followed was 3.5 hours of the hardest riding she'd done in years. The south pasture was half a mile from the ranch house, which in clear weather meant a 10-minute ride. In these conditions, it meant navigating drifts that came up past a horse's knee in the low areas, reading the ground ahead for ice patches, and keeping the animal calm when the wind came off the ridge and hit them sideways. Eliza's horse was a gray mare named Basket. She didn't ask about the name, who was sensible and sure-footed and had the pragmatic character of an animal that had seen enough bad weather to stop being surprised by it. The cattle were where Webb had said they'd be, bunched at the south fence, maybe 60 head, standing close together with their backs to the wind. They were not in danger yet, but another day without access to proper feed, and they would start weakening, and weakened cattle in this temperature moved toward danger faster than most people expected. Moving 60 head of cattle through shin-deep snow with 5 riders, 2 of whom were not professional cattlemen, was not a smooth operation. It was not supposed to be smooth. It was supposed to be done. Cutter was a compact, weathered man of about 40 who communicated largely through gesture and the positioning of his horse. He placed Eliza on the left flank without explanation, just pointed at the position and then moved away. And she took it and held it, reading the herd the way she'd been taught by watching her father work stock on their Wisconsin farm, which was to say she watched the animals at the edges first, because the edges told you what the middle was about to do. The first quarter mile went reasonably well. The lead animals were reluctant but movable. Ethan, riding with Webb on the right flank, was doing better than expected. He had a natural feel for it, the kind you either had or didn't, and he had it. He kept his horse at the right distance from the herd's edge, not pushing, just present, maintaining the pressure that told the animals which direction was acceptable. Then a section of the drift gave way under one of the lead steers. Not catastrophically. The animal didn't go down, didn't injure itself. But it lurched, broke through a crust of hardened snow into a softer layer beneath, and the lurch spooked the three animals behind it. They scattered left, into Eliza's flank. She felt Basket shift under her. The mare had seen it coming before she had, and she gave the horse what she needed, loosening the rein for half a second and then using her leg to direct. And Basket pivoted in the snow and came around the outside of the breaking animals before they got fully free of the herd. She didn't do it gracefully. She nearly went sideways in a drift and had to grab mane to stay on, and there was a moment where it was genuinely unclear whether she was going to manage it. She managed it. She pushed the three animals back into the herd by positioning Basket between them and the open ground to the left, moving slowly, no noise, no sudden motion. The steers grumbled. They resented it. They went back. Nathaniel, riding drag at the rear, had watched the whole thing. He didn't say anything when she rode past him, repositioning to the left flank again. But he watched her with an expression that had moved significantly from where it had started on a station platform 8 days ago. The winter pasture gate was frozen, as predicted. Webb had brought tools, a short iron bar and a mallet, and he and Cutter worked the gate while the rest of them held the herd in a loose group outside it, which required constant attention because cattle in cold weather get ideas about going different directions and don't respond to reason. Ethan was on her side of the group now. The herd had shifted during the gate work, and he'd come around to help hold the left edge. They rode in parallel for a few minutes without speaking, both watching the same animals. "You almost went down back there," Ethan said, "with the three that broke." "I know," she said, "but you didn't." "Basket did most of it," she said. "Good horse." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not a bad rider," he said. It came out like it cost him something. "I've been better," she said. "I haven't ridden in about 4 years. My hands remember what to do, but my body's slow." He absorbed this. "Why'd you stop?" "Didn't have a horse," she said simply. "Hotel kitchens don't come with stables." He almost smiled. Not quite, but the muscles around his mouth moved in a way that was considering it. The gate gave way. Webb and Cutter got it open. It swung hard to the left and dug into the snow, but opened enough. And they moved the herd through in sections, which took another 40 minutes of cold, patient work. When the last animal was through and the gate was wired shut behind them, Eliza sat on Basket in the winter pasture and let herself feel how tired she was. Her thighs were aching from the cold and the work. Her hands inside the gloves had gone from cold to painful to numb somewhere around the second hour. And she was only now at the stage where they were starting to wake up again, which was the part that hurt more. She didn't show any of it. Webb rode up beside her. "Good work on the left flank," he said, when those three broke. "I nearly didn't hold them." "Nearly doesn't count," he said. "You held them." She nodded and turned Basket toward home. The ride back was quieter. The wind had shifted and was at their backs now, which made it easier. Nathaniel rode beside her for part of it, not speaking. Ethan rode ahead with Webb, and she could hear them talking. Not the words, just the sound of it, 2 voices in normal conversation. And she saw Nathaniel's head turn slightly toward that sound, listening. She let him listen without interruption. They were halfway back when he said, "That was well done, the flank work." "The horse is well trained," she said. "I'm complimenting you, not the horse." "I know," she said. "I'm deflecting." He glanced at her. "Why?" She thought about it. "Because I'm not sure what to do with compliments from you yet," she said. "They're new." He looked ahead. After a moment, "That's fair." They rode the rest of the way without talking, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had done something hard together and were allowing themselves the space to be tired about it. Back at the ranch, Dolan, sick as he was, pale and unsteady, had come out and was waiting at the barn to take the horses. Eliza tried to wave him off, but he shook his head with the quiet stubbornness of a man who understood his job and didn't want to be relieved of it. Inside, Evelyn was waiting. She was standing at the kitchen window when they came through the back door, and she turned around and looked at her brother and then at Eliza with an expression that was carefully not showing how worried she'd been. "The soup's still warm," she said. Ethan went to the stove and poured himself a bowl without ceremony. Then he poured a second one and set it on the table near Eliza, again without ceremony, without making it mean anything, and went to sit by the window with his. Eliza sat down and wrapped both hands around the bowl and let the warmth come back into her fingers slowly. Evelyn climbed onto her stool and watched them both with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to read rooms very precisely. "It was bad out there," she said. Not a question. "Cold," Ethan said, "but we got them moved." "All 60? "All 60. Evelyn looked satisfied. "Good." She paused. "Papa's going to his study?" "Probably," Ethan said. "He always goes to his study when something hard is done," Evelyn said, "like he has to go think about it before he can stop thinking about it." Ethan looked at his sister. Something in his expression shifted, the way it does when a person hears a child say something accurate that an adult would have taken longer to find the words for. "Yeah," he said. "That's about right." The storm peaked on the 6th day. Eliza knew it was peaking because the sound of it changed. The low, sustained roar she'd been sleeping under all week climbed in pitch, and then dropped into something that felt physical, a pressure against the walls and roof of the house that was not just wind, but weight. The temperature inside the house dropped 2 degrees overnight despite the fires. One of the shutters on the second floor tore loose, and they could hear it banging against the siding until Webb went up and secured it. The ranch hands who weren't sick were working through the night in rotation, checking the livestock, keeping the barn heating going, making sure the roofs didn't take on too much snow load. It was exhausting work, and it showed on all of them. Webb came in for breakfast on the 6th morning, looking like a man who had been awake for 30 hours because he had been awake for 30 hours. And he sat at the kitchen table and drank 3 cups of coffee without speaking, and then went back out. Eliza worked alongside the crisis in the way she always worked. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but steadily, seeing what needed doing and doing it. She managed the food supply with the precision of someone who had done real rationing before, not the theoretical kind. She stretched what they had without making anyone feel like they were being shorted. She made bread every day because bread fed people for less than almost anything else, and because the smell of it did something to the atmosphere of a cold house that was hard to quantify but wasn't hard to notice. On the 6th afternoon, Rourke, the sick hand who'd been the worst, took a turn for the worse. His fever had been high for 4 days. He was in the bunkhouse, which was warm enough but barely. Webb came to Eliza because there was no one else to come to. Nathaniel was out dealing with a section of the barn roof that had started showing signs of stress under the snow load, and there was no doctor within 15 miles, and 15 miles was impossible. "He's not getting better," Webb said. "His breathing is—" He stopped. "I don't know enough about sick people to know how bad it is." Eliza went to the bunkhouse. Rourke was a big man, maybe 35, red-haired, with the build of someone who'd worked outdoor labor his whole life. He was lying in his bunk looking significantly smaller than that build suggested, which was the particular diminishment of serious illness. His breathing was labored. She could hear the effort in it, the wet quality that meant his chest was involved. She was not a doctor. She was very clear with herself about that. But she had nursed her mother through 2 winters of bad chest illness before her mother died of the 3rd one, and she had kept a crew of 8 stranded railroad workers alive through a Wisconsin ice storm on nothing but broth and willow bark and obsessive attention to hydration and warmth. And she knew the difference between illness that could be managed and illness that couldn't. This one was serious, but it could be managed, if they did it right. She told Webb what she needed: the willow bark from the kitchen pantry, which she'd found on her first day and had already been thinking about, clean cloth, the hottest water the stove could produce, the warmest blankets in the house. She told him to bank every source of heat in the bunkhouse and keep them burning through the night. Then she sat with Rourke for 2 hours, working through the fever management the way her mother had taught her. Cool cloth on the neck and wrists, not the forehead where most people put it, getting water into him in small amounts every 20 minutes, so the fever didn't dehydrate him faster than she could counter it. Rourke was mostly unconscious, but at one point he opened his eyes and looked at her with the unfocused clarity of someone whose defenses were down. "Who are you?" he said. "Eliza Voss," she said. "I'm staying at the house." "The one from the platform," he said. "That's me." He closed his eyes again. Webb said you fixed the feed system, he said, half into his pillow. I moved some things around. He said you rode south flank in the storm. Someone had to. He was quiet for a moment, then, you're not what I expected. She looked at him. People keep saying that. Something that might have been a smile moved across his face before the fever pulled him back under. She was there for another hour. When she came back to the house, it was nearly dark and Nathaniel was standing in the kitchen. He'd been out in the storm and his coat was heavy with snow. He looked at her. How is he? He said. Serious, she said. Not hopeless. If the fever breaks in the next 24 hours, he'll probably be all right. If it doesn't, she paused. We keep working at it. He stood in the middle of the kitchen looking at her. She couldn't read his expression fully. It had too many things in it. You've done this before, he said. My mother got sick 3 winters running. I learned. Did she? 3rd winter, Eliza said. The 3rd winter I wasn't enough. The kitchen was quiet. The storm pressed at the windows. I'm sorry, he said. It was a long time ago. That doesn't always matter, he said. She looked at him. He said it simply, without trying to be wise about it, just as a fact he knew, which meant he knew it from somewhere. 3 years was a long time ago in calendar terms, not always in the other terms. No, she said, it doesn't always matter. She turned back to the stove and he stood in the kitchen for a while longer without going to his study, which was different from his usual pattern, and she let him stand there without making anything of it. The crisis with Rourke's fever coincided with the structural crisis at the barn, which Nathaniel had been managing alone and was not managing well, because one man cannot be in 2 places at once, and this ranch required attention in more places than one man had. Eliza went to the barn the following morning and found Cutter trying to reinforce a beam that had started to bow under the snow load on the roof. The repair he was attempting would work temporarily but not well. He was using the wrong angle of brace for the load direction, which would take the weight partially but redirect a portion of it to the wall section, which already had a weak point she'd noticed on her first day. She didn't say he was wrong. She asked him what he thought about the wall section. He looked at it. That's already been a problem, he admitted. If we brace from this angle, she said, more of the load goes there. He studied it. If we come from the other side, you'd need a longer beam. Do you have one? Maybe. Back of the storage section. He thought about it. That's a better fix. I think so, she said. They spent the next 3 hours reinforcing the barn roof properly, or as properly as was possible with what they had, which was not perfectly, but well enough. The beam held. The wall section held. The barn did not collapse, which was the actual goal. Nathaniel found her afterward, coming out of the barn with sawdust on her coat and a cold that had gotten into her hands again. Cutter told me about the brace, he said. Cutter did the work, she said. He said you knew where the load was going. I've repaired farm structures before. The principles are similar. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression that had been accumulating for several days, each thing she did adding to it, the way water adds to a level until it reaches a mark you'd thought was still far off. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. When the road's open, he stopped, started again. When the storm ends and the road's open, what are your plans? She looked at him. I hadn't made specific ones. I placed that advertisement because I needed someone, he said. I made a mistake about what that meant. I was looking for something, a certain kind of presentation, and I was wrong about what the ranch actually needed. You said that. I'm saying it again because I'm trying to get to something else. He looked at the barn, at the reinforced roof, at the yard where the pump sat wrapped in its burlap. What the ranch needs is what you've been doing this week. And what the children need... He stopped. Ethan talked to me last night. She waited. Actually talked to me. About the herd movement. About the brace work. He had opinions. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something careful, as if he was carrying something fragile. He argued with me about the feed distribution schedule. Said your system was better than mine. It's not my system, she said. It's just a more efficient arrangement. He argued with me, Nathaniel said, like he used to. He looked at her directly. I think you had something to do with that. She didn't answer that directly, because it was partly true and partly not true, and the parts were complicated. I want to offer you a proper position, he said, Not what I advertised, something different. A real position, with real wages, running the household, and working with the ranch operation as needed. He paused. And being here. For the children. She looked at him steadily. That's a significant offer, she said. I know what I'm offering. I'm not Margaret, she said. I want that said clearly before anything else. I know you're not Margaret. He said it without flinching. I'm not asking you to be. And I'm not, she chose her words. I'm not looking for a situation that requires me to fit into a shape someone else left behind. I'm not asking for that either. He paused. I'm asking for what you actually are, which appears to be someone who sees what needs doing and does it without waiting to be told. She looked at the yard, at the barn, at the house where Evelyn was probably at her stool in the kitchen and Rourke was hopefully sleeping his fever down in the bunkhouse, and Webb was somewhere doing the next necessary thing. Let me think about it, she said. He nodded. That's fair. She went inside. She thought about it all through the afternoon, working through the ranch house chores with the particular quality of attention that comes when your hands are busy and your mind is somewhere else. She thought about the $7 she'd had in her envelope. She thought about the boarding house in St. Paul and the hotel kitchen in Milwaukee and the farm in Wisconsin and the trunk with the broken latch and the 9 days on the train. She thought about Evelyn on her stool, watching how to make porridge. She thought about Ethan on the left flank of the herd, holding his position in 2 feet of snow without being told he was doing it right. She thought about the gray scarf on the chest in the East Hall. She was still thinking about it when Rourke's fever broke. Webb came to the kitchen doorway at 9 that night with a look on his face that was as close to relief as his face appeared capable of producing. It broke, he said. He's sweating. His color's changed. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Get him water, she said. Small amounts every quarter hour, and get some broth into him if he can take it. There's stock on the back of the stove. Already started, Webb said. Then he looked at her. You kept him here, he said. Just that, simply. She didn't answer, but she didn't deflect either. She stayed up another 2 hours checking on Rourke, keeping the bunkhouse fires going, moving between the house and the outbuilding in the cold with a lantern, and somewhere in the second hour the storm began, very slightly, almost imperceptibly, to ease. Not stop, but ease. The roar dropped a register. The pressure against the walls lessened by some fraction. She stood in the yard between trips and looked up at the sky, which for the first time in 6 days showed something other than solid cloud. A narrow break, somewhere to the northwest. A darkness that was slightly different from the rest. Not stars. Not yet. But the possibility of stars. The worst of it was passing. She went back inside and stood in the kitchen in the quiet and thought about what Nathaniel had asked her. About what a real position meant. About what it meant to stay somewhere. She had not stayed anywhere in a long time. Not really stayed. Not with the intention of belonging to a place. She had passed through places. She had been useful in them and moved on. This house had a broken stairboard and a cracked east window and a pantry shelf that had been in the wrong order for 2 years. It had a boy who had gone quiet when his father stopped listening, and a girl who gave away her dead mother's belongings to strangers, and a man who had advertised across 4 states for someone who wouldn't leave when it got hard. It was not a perfect house. It was not offering her a perfect situation. But she had never had much use for perfect. Perfect was for people who hadn't learned yet that real things were always imperfect, always incomplete, always requiring more work than you thought they would. Real things were worth the work. That was the point. She turned down the kitchen lamp and went to the East Hall and sat on the edge of the bed with the gray scarf in her lap, the way she had that first night. And this time, when she breathed slowly through the weight of it, she was not calculating odds. She was deciding. Outside, the storm was losing its hold on the territory, degree by degree, inch by inch. The temperature would still kill you if you gave it the chance. The roads were still buried. The work of the ranch was nowhere near finished, and the hard Montana winter had months left to run. But the worst of it was behind them. And when the morning came, Eliza Voss was going to be in the kitchen when the range needed stoking, and the coffee was going to be ready, and she was going to tell Nathaniel Crow her answer. She already knew what it was. She told him yes before the coffee was finished. Not dramatically, not with preamble. He came into the kitchen at first light the way he'd been doing all week. Coat on, face carrying the particular weight of a man with too many things to track. and she was at the stove and she said, without turning around, "I'll take the position." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him pull out the chair and sit down. "On what terms?" he said. He wasn't assuming anything. She respected that. "Wages, same as you'd pay a qualified housekeeper. I want that in writing, not because I don't trust your word, but because written terms protect both of us." She turned and looked at him. "I work the household and I contribute to the ranch operation where I'm useful. I am not a hired hand and I'm not a replacement for anyone. I'm something different from both of those things, and I need that understood." "Understood," he said. "And if it stops working, if either of us decides it's not right, I leave with a month's wages and no argument. That's fair." "One more thing," she said. She put his coffee in front of him and sat down across the table, which was something she hadn't done before. She'd always remained standing, always kept the slight distance of someone in a provisional situation. She sat down now deliberately, because she was not provisional anymore. "Ethan and Evelyn are not my responsibility in the way children are a mother's responsibility. I'm not their mother. I won't try to be. But they are people I intend to take seriously, and if I think something is being handled wrong with either of them, I will tell you, and I expect you to hear it." Nathaniel looked at her across the table. The morning light was coming in at the east window, the cracked one, the one stuffed with cloth. And it fell across his face and showed how tired he was, and underneath the tired, something that had been wound tight for 3 years and was only just beginning to consider the possibility of loosening. "I'll hear it," he said. "Good." She stood back up. "Eat something. You look like you've been awake since before I was." He almost smiled. "I have been." "Then eat." The storm fully released its hold on Blackridge 2 days later. The temperature climbed, slowly, grudgingly, as if the cold resented being pushed back, and the sky cleared from the west in sections, the clouds pulling apart like something that had been held together by pressure and was now allowed to separate. By mid-morning, on the 8th day after Eliza's arrival, the sun was out for the first time, and the entire territory looked like it had been remade overnight, everything white and sharp-edged and painful to look at directly. Webb said the roads would be passable within a day, maybe 2, which meant Blackridge would be reachable, which meant things that had been suspended, mail, supplies, news from outside the ranch, would resume. Eliza had not thought much about Blackridge in the past week. She'd been too occupied. But now, with the crisis easing and the roads opening and the rhythm of the ranch beginning to find something closer to normal, she thought about it. About the platform. About the people who had watched Nathaniel reject her and done nothing. About the ones who had whispered and the ones who had laughed and the ones who had simply walked past her like she was furniture. She didn't carry anger about it the way some people would have. Anger required a kind of sustained attention she preferred to spend elsewhere. But she was not naive about what returning to that town would mean or what people would make of the story. A woman rejected at the station, taken in by the man who rejected her, now staying on his ranch. She knew what people would make of that. The first trip into Blackridge happened on a Thursday, 11 days after her arrival. Nathaniel needed to collect the delayed mail and pick up supplies that had run low during the storm. He asked Eliza if she wanted to come. She said yes without hesitation, because avoiding it wouldn't improve anything. They took the wagon. Webb drove. Nathaniel sat up front with him. Eliza sat in the wagon bed with a list she'd written out: kitchen supplies, specific items for the bunkhouse, 2 things Evelyn had quietly asked for, and 1 thing Ethan had asked for without quite asking, which was a new leather-working awl because his had broken, and he'd mentioned it in passing 3 times while pretending he hadn't. The road into town was rutted from the snow and the thaw and the traffic of the past week, and the wagon moved slowly. Eliza used the time to go over the supply list in her head, thinking about what the kitchen needed for the rest of the winter, because the storm had been a trial run, and she now knew where the gaps were. They arrived in Blackridge at mid-morning. The town looked the same as it had 11 days ago, except for the cleared snow piled in gray heaps along the boardwalks, and the general quality of relief that a community has when a bad storm has passed, and everyone is still there. People moved on the main street with the slightly extra energy of the newly released. Eliza got down from the wagon with her list. She felt the looks immediately. Not all of them. Most people on the street were absorbed in their own business. But enough. The particular kind of attention that means people recognize you and are recalculating something. She walked to the general store. Grady was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in, and his expression moved through several things quickly before settling on a careful neutrality. "Miss Voss," he said, "you're still in the territory." "I am," she said. "I need to fill this list." She put it on the counter. He looked at it, then at her. "You're at the Crow Ranch." "I am." A pause. He picked up the list and started reading it. "Some of these will take me a few minutes to pull together." "I'll wait," she said. She moved to the side of the counter and stood quietly while he worked through the list. The store was not empty. There were 2 other women in the dry goods section, and a man she didn't know examining a display of tools near the window. She was aware of being looked at. She did not acknowledge it. The 2 women left. One of them, a heavy-set woman in a good coat, the kind of woman who knew everybody's business because she made it her purpose to know, paused near Eliza on her way out. "You're the woman from the station," she said. "The one Nathaniel Crow turned away." "I am," Eliza said. The woman looked at her with the particular expression of someone deciding which version of a story to believe. "They're saying you've been at his ranch all through the storm." "The roads were closed," Eliza said, "and Mr. Crow offered a position. I accepted it." "A position," the woman repeated. The word had weight in her mouth. "Running the household," Eliza said, "and assisting with the ranch operation." The woman studied her for another moment. Then she said, "Well, I suppose the storm put everyone in unusual arrangements," and left. Eliza turned back to the counter. Grady was watching her with an expression that suggested he'd heard everything and was filing it. "She'll have that around town by noon," he said. "I know," Eliza said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "Some," she said, "but less than it would have 2 weeks ago." He nodded slowly. He had the look of a man revising his estimate of her, which was becoming a familiar look. "I'll have your order ready in 10 minutes, he said. She thanked him and went back outside to wait. It was on the boardwalk outside the general store, in the cold morning sunlight, that she first encountered Caleb Whitmore. She didn't know who he was. She would learn later. What she knew in the moment was that he was a man of about 55, well-dressed in the particular way of men who wanted you to notice they were well-dressed, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and had since moved into something harder. He was coming out of the bank across the street, and he saw her and he crossed directly to her, which told her he'd been expecting to see her, or someone like her, and had prepared. "Miss Voss," he said. She looked at him. "You have the advantage of me." "Caleb Whitmore," he said. "I own the Whitmore Timber and Land Company. I have holdings throughout this territory." He said this the way men say things they've said many times and expect to have a consistent effect. "All right," she said. He stopped. He'd expected something different from that. "I was at the station when you arrived," he said. "I saw what happened." "Most of the town was at the station," she said. "It was the only train of the day." "I want to be direct with you," he said, which in her experience meant he intended to be something other than direct. "Please," she said. "Nathaniel Crow is a significant man in this territory. His ranch, his cattle operation, they represent a substantial portion of the regional economy. When things happen at the Crow Ranch, people notice. People talk." "I've observed that," she said. "What you may not understand," Whitmore continued, "is that there are ongoing business arrangements between Crow's operation and other interests in this territory, including mine, that are sensitive to questions of reputation and judgment." He paused. "A man who takes in a strange woman under unclear circumstances, at a time when he's already known to be—" He paused again, choosing. "Vulnerable. That's the kind of thing that raises questions." Eliza looked at him steadily. He was not threatening her directly. He was too careful for that. He was describing a landscape in which she was a potential problem. "What kind of questions?" she said. "Questions about his judgment, about whether he's making sound decisions, about whether certain parties might need to reconsider the terms of their arrangements with him." She was quiet for a moment. The morning air was cold and clean, and the sun was very bright off the snow. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I've been on the Crow Ranch for 11 days. In that time, I reorganized the household supply system, helped move 60 head of cattle through a blizzard, reinforced a barn roof that was at risk of failure, and kept one of the ranch hands alive through a serious fever. Which of those things raises questions about Mr. Crow's judgment?" Whitmore blinked. He hadn't expected that either. I'm not suggesting... You're suggesting that my presence is damaging, she said. I'm suggesting that the ranch is in better condition than it was 11 days ago, and that Mr. Crow's judgment in offering me a position was sound. If your business arrangements with him depend on your opinion of his personal household decisions, that seems like a fragile basis for a business arrangement. He looked at her for a long moment. Something had moved in his expression. The prepared version of this conversation had not included this version of her. You're more forthright than I expected, he said. People keep being surprised by that, she said. He studied her. You should understand that I have significant influence in this territory, he said, with the bank, with the land office, with the railroad consortium. I understand that you're telling me you do, she said. A pause. I'm simply suggesting that it would be in everyone's interest if the situation at the Crow Ranch resolved itself simply. If you were to decide the position wasn't what you expected and move on, that would be convenient for you, she said. I understand, but I've accepted a position and I intend to fulfill it. She picked up her supply package from where she'd set it against the wall. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. She walked back toward the wagon. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not entirely, but that was between her and herself. Webb was loading the wagon bed when she got there. He looked at her, then passed her at Whitmore, who was still standing on the boardwalk. Whitmore, Webb said, not a question. He introduced himself, she said. What did he want? To suggest that I should leave, she said. Webb loaded a crate with more force than was strictly necessary. He's been after Nathaniel's South grazing rights for 3 years, he said. Uses the bank connection to apply pressure when he can. Nathaniel won't sell. He paused. A disruption at the ranch, anything that makes Nathaniel look unstable or poorly managed, plays into Whitmore's argument that the operation is mishandled and the land would be better developed. Eliza thought about this. She thought about the way Whitmore had said vulnerable, the way he'd said unclear circumstances. He's going to make something of this publicly, she said. Probably already started, Webb said. The woman at Grady's store. She's a cousin of Whitmore's wife. Nothing in this town goes from mouth to ear without going through that family first. Eliza stood beside the wagon and looked at the street, at the bank, at the general store, at the ordinary morning activity of a small frontier town that contained, like all small frontier towns, the full range of human motivation from the generous to the self-serving. All right, she said. All right, what? I'm just thinking, she said. Nathaniel came out of the post office with a bundle of mail under his arm and a look on his face that had moved from neutral to something tighter. Problem? Webb said. Letter from the Territorial Bank, Nathaniel said. They want to review the terms of the operating loan. Review is a courtesy word for renegotiate. He looked at the envelope. This started when the storm did, or before it. This isn't about the storm. He looked up and saw Whitmore still on the boardwalk across the street. Whitmore met his gaze and then went inside the bank with the particular unhurried quality of a man who has decided the point has been made. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He approached Miss Voss, Webb said. Nathaniel looked at her. What did he say? He suggested that my presence was creating questions about your judgment, she said. He implied that if I left, things might be simpler. And? I told him the ranch was in better condition than when I arrived, and that his opinion of your household decisions was an unstable basis for a business arrangement. Nathaniel stared at her. You said that. More or less, she said. He looked back at the bank. Something was working in his expression. Not anger exactly, or not only anger, something more complex. The particular feeling of a man who has been pressured in a sensitive place and is deciding whether to be careful about it or not. Get in the wagon, he said. I need to think. On the drive back, he was quiet. The kind of quiet that was full rather than empty. She let him have it. She looked at the territory going past, the snow, the mountains, the enormous sky, and thought about Whitmore and the bank and what a man with those kinds of connections could actually do. Quite a lot, was the answer, if he chose to. It was Evelyn who noticed something was wrong when they got back. She had the particular antennae of a child who has spent years reading adult faces for information she wasn't directly given, and she looked at her father when he came through the door and said, What happened? Nothing for you to worry about, Nathaniel said. That's what you say when it's something, Evelyn said. Ethan, Coming down the stairs, looked at Webb. Webb gave him a minimal headshake that communicated, later. That evening, after the children were upstairs, Nathaniel sat at the kitchen table with the bank letter and two other pieces of mail spread in front of him, and Eliza sat across from him, and he told her the fuller picture. Whitmore had been working at the edges of Nathaniel's operation for 3 years. It had started shortly after Margaret died, which was the timing of a man who watched for moments of weakness with professional attention. The South grazing land was the primary target. It connected two sections of Whitmore's timber holdings and would significantly increase his land value if he could acquire it. But there had been other pressures. Delays at the land office when Nathaniel filed for a grazing extension. A shift in the bank's loan terms, subtle but real, that added carrying costs. Two of his seasonal workers who had left and later turned up working for Whitmore's operation, which might have been coincidence. "It's not coincidence," Webb said from the doorway. He had a habit of appearing in doorways at relevant moments. "Harlan left because Whitmore paid him twice what we were paying. He told me. He wasn't apologetic about it." "So he's been applying pressure for 3 years," Eliza said, "and now he has something new to use." "Me," she said. "The story of what he can make of you," Nathaniel said. "A woman of unknown background taken in by a widower under questionable circumstances. It doesn't matter that the reality is straightforward. What matters is what it can be made to sound like." He paused. "I've built this operation on my reputation as much as on the land and the cattle. Reputation is currency here. Whitmore knows that." "What's his specific play with the bank?" she asked. Nathaniel spread his hands over the letter. "He's on the board. Not the chairman, but he has influence. The review of the operating loan is framed as routine, post-storm assessment of collateralized operations, that kind of language. But the timing is not routine," she said. "No." She looked at the letter. It was carefully written, the language of a legal document, qualified and hedged, giving nothing away outright. The kind of letter that was threatening precisely because it didn't say anything threatening. "What do you need to counter it?" she asked. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The bank review. What would make it come out in your favor regardless of Whitmore's pressure?" "A strong operational record," he said. "Cattle numbers, feed inventory, infrastructure condition, evidence that the ranch is sound." "Do you have that documentation?" "Some. The winter's been—" He stopped. "I've been managing the operation, not documenting it." "Then we document it," she said. "Everything that's been done in the past 2 weeks. Cattle moved and where they are. Feed inventory before and after. Barn repairs. Water system repairs. Staff illness and recovery." She paused. "Rourke alive and on his feet is documentation of the ranch's capacity to manage a crisis." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "You're thinking like a lawyer," he said. "I'm thinking like someone who's watched people lose things because they didn't write them down," she said. "The Whitmore problem is a reputation problem. You counter a reputation problem with a record. Facts are harder to argue with than impressions." Webb made a sound from the doorway. "She's right," he said. "The bankmen respond to numbers. Give them numbers that are better than they expected, and Whitmore's social pressure loses half its weight." Nathaniel sat with this. He had the look of a man who was used to solving problems through force of will and direct action, and was finding it necessary to use a different tool. "I'll need help putting it together," he said. "I'm not—" He paused, and it was clearly not easy to say. "I'm not organized in the way this requires." "I know," she said. "I've seen your filing system." He looked mildly offended. "It's functional." "It's heroic that anything gets found in it," she said. "But yes, I'll help put it together." They spent the next 3 evenings doing it. Nathaniel had records, more than she'd expected, actually, once she started going through the filing cabinet in his study, which was not so much a system as a geological record of decisions made and papers placed somewhere and more papers placed on top. But the information was there, cattle numbers going back 4 years, grazing records, equipment costs, staff wages, revenue from cattle sales. She organized it. Not him. She organized it, sitting at his desk in the evenings while he sat across the room, answering questions when she had them, watching what she did with an expression that moved between discomfort and respect in roughly equal parts. Ethan started appearing in the doorway of the study in the evenings, not coming in, just there, watching what they were doing. On the second evening, Nathaniel said, without looking up from the ledger he was reading, Pull a chair in if you're going to stand there. Ethan pulled a chair in. He sat without speaking for a while. Then he said, "What's the Whitmore problem?" Nathaniel and Eliza both looked at him. "Ethan?" Nathaniel started. "I'm 14, Ethan said. "I'm not going to be 14 forever. And this is my ranch too, eventually." He looked at his father. "Tell me what's happening." A silence. Nathaniel looked at Eliza. She looked back at him without expression, which was her way of saying, "Your call." Nathaniel told his son, "Not everything. Not the financial details, not the specific bank letter language, but the shape of it. Whitmore, the land, the pressure, the story he was constructing." Ethan listened without interrupting. His face did the thing it had been doing lately. Not closed the way it had been for 3 years, but concentrated. Processing. When Nathaniel finished, Ethan said, "Old Thomas Reed was at the station the day she arrived." Both of them looked at him. "He was standing near the baggage area," Ethan said. "I was there with Webb, waiting for a part we'd ordered. Reed's the retired railroad supervisor, been in Blackridge 30 years. He watches everything." He paused. "I saw him looking at Miss Voss when—" He stopped, looked at Eliza. "When my father said what he said, Reed had a look on his face." "What kind of look?" Eliza said. "Like he recognized you," Ethan said, "or recognized something about you. I didn't think much of it at the time." Eliza went very still. She ran back through her memory of the platform, the crowd. She had not been looking at faces. She had been managing the trunk and managing herself, which had taken most of her available attention. She hadn't noticed an older man watching her. "Do you know Thomas Reed?" she asked Nathaniel. "Everyone knows Reed," Nathaniel said. "He was the territorial railroad supervisor for 15 years. He knows every person who's moved through this region by rail for the last 3 decades. He paused. "Why? What does it mean?" "I don't know yet," she said. But she was thinking about the stranded workers in the Wisconsin ice storm, about the crew of 8 she'd kept alive for 6 days on broth and willow bark and stubbornness, about the fact that railroad workers talked to each other across great distances and long years, because railroads connected everything and the people who worked them formed a kind of extended memory of the territory they served. "If Reed recognized me," she said slowly, "it's from before. And before was—" She stopped. "Before was what?" Nathaniel said. She looked at him. "There was a storm in Wisconsin 8 years ago. A bad one. A crew of railroad workers, 8 men, got stranded in a maintenance cabin between stations. The storm closed everything for 6 days." She paused. "I was 17 miles from where they were stranded, at my family's farm. When word came that men were trapped, I went out with what I had." "By yourself?" Ethan said. "My father was ill," she said simply. "There was no one else." The study was very quiet. "Did they survive?" Nathaniel asked. "All 8, she said. "Some of them were in bad shape by the time help arrived officially, but all 8. Nathaniel looked at her with an expression that had moved well past the precursor of respect into something complete. "If Reed was on that crew," he said, "or knew men who were—" "Then Whitmore's story about a woman of unknown background isn't the only story," Eliza said. "And stories, in a place like this, are currency. You said so yourself." A silence. Ethan stood up. "I'll find out where Reed takes his breakfast," he said. He said it with the matter-of-fact competence of a boy who has decided to be useful and knows how. "Ethan," Nathaniel started. "I'll be careful," Ethan said. "I'm not going to say anything about Whitmore. I'll just talk to him." He looked at his father. "I can do this." Another silence. Father and son, looking at each other in the lamplight. "All right," Nathaniel said. Ethan left. Nathaniel sat for a moment after the boy's footsteps faded. Then he said quietly, "He's different than he was 2 weeks ago." "He needed to be asked to do something real," Eliza said. "I should have been doing that." "You should have," she said, "but you're doing it now." He looked at her. "You're not going to soften that for me." "I don't think you need things softened," she said. "I think you need them said." He picked up his pen and went back to the ledger. But there was something different about the set of his shoulders. Something that had been held too tight for too long was beginning, just beginning, to release. Eliza went back to the filing. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the temperature still below freezing but without the murderous quality of the storm week. The stars were out, visible now through the east window, the cracked one, which she had stuffed fresh cloth into that morning to stop the draft. She thought about Whitmore on this boardwalk, his careful voice, his careful words. She thought about Thomas Reed at the station platform, watching. She thought about 8 railroad workers in a Wisconsin cabin and a 17-mile walk in a Wisconsin storm and the particular arithmetic of deciding to go when no one told you to go. She had never told anyone that story. Not here, not in St. Paul, not in Milwaukee. She had lived in a way that moved forward and did not look back because looking back required energy she preferred to spend on what was in front of her. But some things, it turned out, followed you without requiring your attention. Some things had already arrived ahead of you and were waiting, patient as snow, for the right moment to become useful. She put the last of the sorted papers into the correct stack and looked at what they'd built. 3 evenings of work, a clear record of an operation that was not perfect but was sound, managed by a man who was not easy but was not dishonest, on land that had been earned and worked and would not be handed over to a timber company's land scheme without a fight. She capped the ink. "That's everything," she said. Nathaniel looked at the stacks, at the organized record of 11 years of his ranch. "It looks like a different operation," he said. "It's the same operation," she said. "It just looks like someone's paying attention." He looked at her. "Someone is," he said. She did not answer that. She put the cap back on the ink, straightened the final stack, and said goodnight, and went down the east hall to her room where the gray scarf was on the chest and the cracked window was properly stuffed against the cold. Tomorrow, Ethan would find Thomas Reed. And whatever Reed carried in his memory of a Wisconsin winter 8 years ago would either matter or it wouldn't. But tonight the record was made, the operation was documented. The ranch was standing, and the people in it were, each of them, a little less alone than they had been the morning a woman stepped off a train carrying a trunk and a pot and a worn coat, and a man said the wrong thing in front of the whole town, and the world continued turning anyway, the way it always does. Indifferent to human error, patient with human effort, waiting to see what people would do next. Ethan came back from town the next morning with snow on his boots and Thomas Reed's story in his hands. He didn't tell it dramatically. He wasn't that kind of boy. Or wasn't anymore, having learned somewhere in the past 3 years that drama was a way of making yourself the center of something when what you actually wanted was to be taken seriously. He came into the kitchen where Eliza was working and his father was at the table with the ledgers, and he sat down and pulled off his gloves and said, "Reed was on the crew." The kitchen went quiet. "Which crew?" Nathaniel said, though he already knew. "Wisconsin, the storm, 8 years ago." Ethan looked at Eliza. He was the track supervisor for that section. He said he remembered because it was the worst 6 days of his life, and then it wasn't anymore. He paused. He said a girl came out of nowhere with a pot of broth and enough stubbornness to keep 8 grown men from giving up. Eliza was at the stove with her back to them. She didn't turn around. "He said a girl," Ethan continued. "He didn't know your name then. He said the local people just called you the Voss farm girl. But he remembered your face. He said when he saw you on the platform, when my father—" He stopped, looked at his father. "When you said what you said, Reed said he wanted to speak up right then. He said he should have." "Why didn't he?" Nathaniel asked. "He said he wasn't sure it was his place." Ethan's voice had a particular quality, not judgment, but the recording of a fact he had formed a private opinion about. He said he regretted it. The fire in the range made its sounds. Outside, a horse moved in the yard. "Does he know about Whitmore?" Eliza asked. "I didn't tell him directly," Ethan said, "but he's lived in Blackridge 30 years. I didn't have to tell him much. I just told him that there were people in town making something out of your being here, and that the something wasn't accurate." He paused. He said he'd been thinking about speaking up since the platform. He said having a reason was enough. Nathaniel looked at his son. The particular look of a man watching a boy handle something with more skill than he'd expected. "You did well," he said. Ethan received this without fanfare. "Reed wants to come to the ranch," he said, "to talk to you. And to—" He looked at Eliza. "To you." "When?" she said. "Tomorrow, if the road holds." She nodded. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady, but she felt the weight of it. Not unpleasant, but real. The weight of something you buried a long time ago coming back up through the ground into the light. She had not thought of that Wisconsin storm in years. She had not thought of it the way other people might, as something that defined her, because she had never thought of what she did that winter as exceptional. She had gone because men were dying, and she was close enough to go. She had stayed because they needed her to stay. She had come home because that was what you did when the thing was done. She had not thought of it as a story. She had not thought of it at all, particularly. But it had been a story all along, carried in the memory of 8 men and a retired railroad supervisor who had stood on a platform and watched a woman be dismissed and said nothing, and spent the weeks since then carrying the weight of that silence. Thomas Reed arrived the next afternoon in a wagon driven by his grandson, a boy of about 12 who waited outside with the horse while the old man came into the ranch house. He was 70-something, lean, with the careful movements of someone who had once been fast and strong and was now working with a body that required more negotiation than it used to. His face had a quality she recognized from old working men. Not weathered exactly, but used, in the best sense, the way a good tool is used and shows it. He came into the kitchen and he saw her, and he stopped. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Reed," she said, "can I get you coffee?" He sat at the kitchen table and she put coffee in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around it and looked at her across the table with the direct, slightly wondering gaze of a man confronting a memory made real. "I should have spoken at the station," he said. "No preamble. I was too old for preamble." "You weren't obligated to," she said. "That's not the same as whether I should have." He looked at his coffee. "I've had the choice between what I'm obligated to and what I should do before, and I've gotten it wrong enough times to know the difference." He looked up. "I'm getting it right now. Late, but right." Nathaniel was at the other end of the table. He said, "What do you remember?" Reed told it plainly. He had been 43 years old, the track supervisor for the northern Wisconsin rail section, when the storm came in January of 1879. The maintenance crew, 8 men, had been doing a routine section check when the storm closed the line. The nearest station was too far. They sheltered in a maintenance cabin stocked for short emergencies, not 6 days of blizzard. By the second day, the food was running low. By the fourth day, 2 of the men had fever. By the 5th day, Reed had started to think about how to write the letters to the families. And then the girl came. She had walked, not ridden, walked, 17 miles from the farm, in the middle of the storm, with a sled she'd made herself, carrying food and medicine and firewood in amounts that seemed physically impossible given what she was. She arrived at the cabin door and knocked on it the way someone knocks when they have every right to be there, and when Reed opened it, he thought he was seeing things, because no one should have been able to get through that storm, and she clearly had. "I asked her how she found us," Reed said. "She said she followed the rail line. She said she knew where the maintenance cabin was because she'd passed it 100 times on the way to town." He paused. "She stayed 5 days. She managed the fever cases, rationed everything down to the last measure, kept the fire going through 2 nights when the wood ran low by using the sledge runners for fuel." He looked at Eliza. When the rescue party finally came through from the station, all 8 men were standing on their feet, cold and hungry and rough, but standing. The kitchen was very quiet. The rescue party foreman asked her name, Reed continued. She said Eliza Voss from the Voss farm, and then she walked home. Didn't wait for thanks, didn't ask for anything. He shook his head slowly. "I looked for a way to send something to the farm, payment, or at least a letter. By the time I got an address organized, her parents had died and the farm was sold and she was gone." He looked at her directly. "I've thought about those 5 days more times than I can count, about what it costs a person to do what you did. The kind of thing most people don't do because they've reasoned themselves into why it isn't their responsibility." Eliza said nothing for a moment, then, "The reasoning wasn't complicated. They were there and I was close enough." "That's what makes it the kind of thing it was," Reed said. "The people who do the most necessary things always say that." He looked at Nathaniel. "I understand there's a man in town making stories," he said. "Whitmore," Nathaniel said. "I know Whitmore's type," Reed said. "Been knowing them since before Whitmore was born. They smell opportunity in other people's trouble and they call it business." He set down his coffee cup. "I'm an old man and I don't have money or land to offer you. But I have 30 years of reputation in this territory, and I have 8 men scattered across 3 states who would write a letter or come in person if it helped the woman who kept them alive." He paused. "I intend to tell what I know." In town, at the bank meeting, if you'll have me, wherever it's useful. That's what I came to say. Nathaniel looked at the old man for a long moment. I'll have you, he said. Reed nodded. He picked up his coffee again and looked at Eliza. You look the same, he said. Older, but the same. I was 19, she said. You seemed older then too, he said. Some people come into the world already knowing things the rest of us spend a lifetime learning. She looked at him. She didn't deflect this time. I learned them the hard way, she said. Same as most people. Yes, he said, but you used them. That's the part that isn't the same as most people. The bank meeting happened 10 days later. In those 10 days, several things occurred in a sequence that Eliza could not have fully predicted, but that, in retrospect, had the quality of inevitability, the kind of thing that feels like fate, but is actually just the accumulated weight of a great many small choices finally arriving at a visible result. Reed told his story in town. Not dramatically, not publicly in a speech. He was too old and too measured for theater. He told it the way he'd always operated, through the network of men and women who had known him for 30 years and whose opinion of his honesty was not in question. He told it to the barber and to the hardware store owner and to the 3 men he played cards with on Thursday evenings, one of whom was the assistant manager of the territorial bank. He told it to the women who had stood on the platform and whispered, because those women had daughters and mothers and sisters, and the story of a 19-year-old girl walking 17 miles alone through a blizzard to keep 8 strangers alive hit them somewhere specific and deep. The woman in the good coat, Whitmore's wife's cousin, heard it and had the particular human experience of feeling her prior story about Eliza collapse, and a different one rise to take its place. She was not a bad woman. She was a woman who had reached for the convenient interpretation the way most people do, and who, when given a different set of facts, had the decency to revise. She was not the only one. Caleb Whitmore felt the shift before he could measure it precisely. He had spent his career reading rooms and reading towns, and he could tell when the atmosphere changed, the way you can tell when weather is building even before the specific clouds arrive. He had built a careful architecture of suggestion and implication and social pressure, and now something was working against it, and he couldn't pinpoint the exact mechanism, only feel the effect. He was not a man who let that stand without response. 3 days before the bank meeting, he paid a call to Nathaniel's ranch. Eliza saw his wagon coming up the road from the kitchen window, and she went to find Nathaniel immediately. "Whitmore," she said, "coming up the drive." Nathaniel's expression did what it did when he was managing something he felt strongly about and did not intend to mishandle. It went still. "All right," he said. "Do you want me?" "Stay," he said. It came out more simply than she expected, not a command, just a preference stated without decoration. "I don't have anything to say to Caleb Whitmore that I'm not willing to say in front of you." She stayed. Whitmore came in through the front door, which nobody used, they all used the kitchen door, and stood in the front hall with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and the expression of a man who had calculated this visit carefully and was proceeding according to plan. "Nathaniel," he said. "Caleb," Nathaniel said. "Kitchen." They went to the kitchen. Whitmore saw Eliza and something moved in his expression. Not surprise, not quite. Recalibration. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Nobody sat down. That was Nathaniel's choice. He stayed standing, which meant nobody sat, which meant this was not a conversation that was going to take long. "I'll be straightforward," Whitmore said. I was looking at Nathaniel. "I understand there's been some talk around town about the railroad story." "It's not a story," Nathaniel said. "It happened." "I don't doubt it," Whitmore said. He was too careful to dispute facts when they were already established in the community's mind. "I'm saying the talk has created a certain atmosphere. I'm not sure it's in anyone's interest for the bank meeting to become a public occasion." He paused. "I want to propose a resolution before it gets to that." "What resolution?" Nathaniel said. Whitmore looked at the kitchen, at Eliza, back at Nathaniel. "I'm prepared to withdraw my request for the loan review," he said. "The bank will leave the operating terms as they stand. In exchange—" He stopped. "In exchange for what?" Nathaniel said. "The south grazing section," Whitmore said. "A fair market price. I've had it assessed. I'll pay what it's worth." No argument. The kitchen was quiet. Eliza watched Nathaniel's face. She watched him consider it. She could see him doing it, working through the arithmetic of the offer. The South grazing section was significant, but not irreplaceable. The loan pressure was real, and the bank meeting had risk in it regardless of Reed's testimony. A clean resolution was not nothing. She did not say anything. It was not her land. It was not her decision. Nathaniel looked at Whitmore for a long moment. Something was working in his expression that was not quite anger and not quite contempt. It was something closer to clarity. The particular clarity of a man who has been maneuvered for 3 years and has finally traced the mechanics of the maneuvering back to their source and is deciding, now that he can see the whole machine, what he actually wants to do about it. "No," he said. Whitmore blinked. "The terms are fair." "I know they're fair," Nathaniel said. "I'm not selling because the terms aren't fair. I'm not selling because the South section isn't for sale." He looked at Whitmore steadily. "It was never for sale. You've been applying pressure for 3 years to manufacture a situation where I'd feel I had to sell, and I'm telling you now that situation doesn't exist. The bank meeting will happen. The record of this operation will speak for itself. And if you have influence at the bank, I suggest you consider carefully how you use it, because Thomas Reed has connections in this territory that extend considerably further than yours. And he is not," he paused, "he is not inclined to be quiet." Whitmore stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hand and the expression of a man whose plan had arrived at an unexpected wall. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I'm making it accurate," Nathaniel said. "There's a difference." He looked at him. "Caleb, I've known you for 15 years. I know you're not a stupid man. So I'll say this plainly. The story you were building about this woman is gone. The town knows what she did in Wisconsin. The bank's assistant manager knows it. 3 of the men she kept alive have already written letters that Reed is holding, and if those letters become part of the bank meeting record, your position on the board becomes a complication you'd rather not have." He let this land. "So, take the offer off the table, drop the loan review, and we go back to being 2 men in the same territory who do business occasionally and stay out of each other's way." A long silence. Whitmore put his hat back on. "You've gotten confident," he said. "It was not quite an insult and not quite a compliment." "I've gotten clear," Nathaniel said. "There's a difference there, too." Whitmore left. They heard his wagon on the drive, and then the road, and then nothing. Nathaniel stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he sat down heavily in his chair at the table, the way a man sits when he's been holding himself upright through an effort of will and can finally stop. "He'll drop it," Eliza said. "Probably," Nathaniel said. "Not probably," she said. "The letter risk is real and he knows it. Men like Whitmore don't hold positions that cost more than they gain." He looked at her. "You calculated that." "The letter risk." "While you were talking," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know about the letters." "Reed mentioned them to me yesterday," she said. "I didn't know if you'd need them. I thought it was better to have them available." He looked at her with the expression that had been building since the platform, since the scarf, since the soup, since the cattle drive, since Rourke's fever, since the filing cabinet, since all of it, and had finally arrived at something whole. "Eliza," he said. She waited. "I owe you more than wages," he said. "You don't," she said. "The wages are the agreement. Everything else is just—" She stopped. "Just what the situation required. That's what you always say. Because it's always true." He looked at the table, at his hands, at the ledger still stacked at the end of it, organized now, readable, a record of something real. "I said something to you on a platform," he said, "in front of a town full of people. And I've apologized for it twice, but I don't think either time I said what I actually meant." "You don't have to—" "I looked at your coat," he said, "and your trunk, and I made a judgment in 30 seconds that I've been making about people my whole life, and I've been wrong before, but never so wrong, and never in a way that—" He stopped. "I saw a woman I thought I understood, and I was so certain, and I was so wrong, and then you gave that boy your scarf, and I went back out in a blizzard because something in me couldn't leave it the way I'd left it." "I know," she said. "I don't think you know all of it," he said. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like this easily. She could see what it cost him, the precise discomfort of a person who has kept their interior life private for so long that exposing any part of it feels like a structural risk. "I went back because I felt guilty," he said. "That's the part I told myself." But that's not all of it. I went back because something about watching you walk away, watching you pick up that trunk alone and walk into a storm alone, was something I couldn't sit with. He looked at her. I've lost enough people. I didn't want to lose someone I hadn't even... He stopped. Someone I hadn't even given a fair chance yet. The kitchen was very still. Outside, somewhere across the yard, Webb was talking to Cutter in the normal sounds of a ranch at afternoon work. The sounds of a place that was functioning, that was attended to, that was not falling quietly apart the way it had been. Nathaniel, she said. Don't tell me it's fine, he said. I know it's fine. I'm not asking you to reassure me. I wasn't going to, she said. I was going to say that I came here with a trunk and a pot and $7, and I have stayed because it was worth staying, not because I had nowhere else to go. I could have gone. When the roads opened, I could have gotten on a train. She paused. I stayed because this house needed attending to, and because your children deserved someone who would take them seriously, and because... She paused again. Because it turned out there were things here worth staying for. He looked at her. That's as close to sentimental as you get, isn't it? He said. It's fairly close, she said. Something in his face moved. It was not quite a smile, and it was not quite relief. It was the expression of a man who has been locked in a cold room for a long time and has just noticed that someone left the door open. The bank meeting happened on a Tuesday. Whitmore did not attend. His representative sent a letter withdrawing the request for the loan review, citing a reassessment of the triggering conditions. The bank chairman read it with the particular expression of a man who understood exactly what it meant and chose not to make it complicated. The meeting proceeded as routine. Nathaniel presented the operational record, organized, complete, clear, and it was received as what it was, evidence of a functioning enterprise managed with competence and attention. Thomas Reed was there. He did not speak unless asked, but he was there, which was a kind of speaking, and everyone in that room understood it. Afterward, on the street outside the bank, Reed shook Nathaniel's hand and then turned to Eliza. I'm glad you stayed, he said. So am I, she said. He looked at her for a moment. He was going to say something else. She could see it forming, and then he decided not to, which was the right decision. Some things don't need to be finished. Some things are complete in the leaving of them. He tipped his hat and walked to his wagon, and his grandson helped him up, and they drove away down the main street of Black Ridge into an afternoon that was cold and clear and very bright. Spring came late to Montana that year. It came the way spring always comes to that country. Not in a rush, not dramatically, but in a slow, persistent reclaiming, inch by inch, the brown grass showing through the white in patches, and then larger patches, and then all at once the meadow below the winter pasture was green in a way that seemed to have happened overnight, though of course it hadn't. The creek that ran the eastern boundary of the Crow Ranch came up with the snowmelt and ran loud for 3 weeks, and then settled. The cattle that had been moved and managed and worried over through the long winter emerged from it in better condition than Nathaniel had seen in 4 years. He said this to Eliza at the kitchen table one morning in a tone that was matter-of-fact and not particularly humble, which was his way of giving credit while maintaining the general position that he was not a man who gushed. The feed system, he said. The reorganization held the waste down. It was an efficient arrangement, she said. I know, he said. I'm saying it worked. I know you are, she said. He looked at her over his coffee cup. You're going to make me just say thank you, aren't you? I'm not making you do anything, she said. Thank you, he said. You're welcome, she said. This was approximately how they had learned to talk to each other, with the particular shorthand of two people who respected each other's intelligence enough to dispense with the scaffolding that most conversations required. They disagreed regularly about the cattle operation schedule, about what Ethan should and shouldn't be asked to take on, about whether the east window needed replacing entirely or could be repaired. She said replaced, he said repaired. And it turned out they were both partially right, which neither of them acknowledged directly, but both of them registered. They were not always easy together. She was not a woman who had softened herself to fit other people's comfort, and he was not a man who had ever had to reckon with someone who wouldn't. There were evenings when she said something direct, and he went quiet with it for a day before he could come back and respond. And there were mornings when his particular way of managing the household through assumption rather than conversation made her set down what she was holding more carefully than was strictly necessary. They were not a perfect arrangement. They were a real one. Ethan turned 15 in March. His birthday fell on a Wednesday, and Eliza made him a meal of everything she'd learned he preferred. The beef stew with the particular spicing he'd told her about without meaning to by eating 3 portions of it the first time she made it. The biscuits, the apple preserve. She did not make it into an occasion. She just put the food on the table, and when he came in from the barn and saw what was there, he looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to show what it actually felt. "It's Wednesday," he said. "It's your birthday," she said. "I didn't say anything about it." "I know," she said. He sat down. He looked at the food. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. And it came out differently from the way he said thank you for routine things. It came out with the particular freight of a boy who had spent 3 years not being seen by the people who should have been seeing him, and who was learning, slowly, awkwardly, with all the stops and starts of a real process, what it felt like to be seen again. She nodded. She put his plate in front of him and went back to the stove. Nathaniel came in a few minutes later and saw the spread of food, and then looked at Eliza and then at his son and did not say anything for a moment. Then he sat down across from Ethan and said, "The mare's going to foal in the next week. I was thinking you could take the lead on it." Ethan looked up. "The lead? Webb will be there, but you'd be the primary. Your call on the decisions." He paused. "You've been watching her all winter. You know her condition better than anyone." Ethan stared at his father. "You're trusting me with the foal." "I'm trusting you with the foal," Nathaniel said. Simply. Without qualification. Something happened in Ethan's face that he couldn't fully control. The particular expression of a boy receiving something he'd wanted for a long time without quite being able to name it. He looked down at his plate before either adult could see the full extent of it. "All right," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "Good," Nathaniel said, and picked up his fork. Evelyn came down for dinner and ate her stew and announced partway through the meal that she had decided to learn to read maps because she wanted to know where everything was. Not just this ranch, but everything, all the way to the ocean she'd never seen. Nathaniel said that was a reasonable ambition. Eliza said she had an old atlas in her trunk, and Evelyn could start with that. Ethan said the ocean was cold, and she probably wouldn't like it, and Evelyn told him that he didn't know what she'd like, and Nathaniel told them both to eat, and the kitchen was loud with the particular loud of a family that was arguing about something small and alive. It was the best Wednesday in that house in 3 years. In the beginning of April, on a clear evening when the last of the snowmelt was running in the fields and the sky had turned the particular color it turns in Montana in spring, enormous and blue, so blue it was almost structural, like something you could lean against, Nathaniel came to find Eliza where she was sitting on the front steps. She was reading, or had been reading. The book was closed in her lap and she was watching the light change in the west and thinking about nothing specific, which was something she rarely allowed herself and which felt, in this moment, like a small luxury she had earned. He sat down beside her, not at a distance, beside her. They sat for a while without speaking, which they had also learned to do, to occupy the same space without requiring words to justify it. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "Not the way I did before," he said. "Before I was asking because the ranch needed someone and the children needed someone, and those were real reasons, but they weren't the whole reason." She waited. "I'm asking now because—" He stopped. He was not a man who articulated interior things with ease, and she had learned not to fill the silences for him, because when she did, he never quite found the end of what he was trying to say. "Because I don't want to imagine this house without you in it," he said. "Not for the ranch. Not for the children. For me." He looked at her. "I know what I'm asking. I know you've built something here that's yours on its own terms, and I'm not asking you to give that up or to become something different. I'm asking if what we are, what this is something you'd want to make permanent." The light was going. The west was turning orange and then red and then the particular deep rose that preceded the dark. She looked at the ranch. At the barn where Ethan's foal, born 2 weeks prior, small and ridiculous-looking and healthy, was already moving around with the wobbly determination of new things. At the east window, replaced now, properly, glass set solid in a new frame. At the pump in the yard with its permanent burlap wrap, doing its job in all weather. She thought about what permanence meant for a woman who had not had a permanent thing since she was 23, who had lived in borrowed spaces and provisional situations, always excellent at the practical management of whatever was in front of her, never quite allowing herself the belief that anything was going to hold. She thought about what it had cost her to walk into this house, the calculations she'd done in the cold, the deliberate decision to engage rather than pass through, to let herself care about the cracked window and the disorganized pantry and the boy at the top of the stairs with his arms crossed and the girl holding out her dead mother's scarf. She had cared. She had let herself care, which was the risk, which was always the risk. And it had held. Not perfectly. Not without difficulty. Not without the ongoing work of two imperfect people trying to be honest with each other in a cold climate with complicated children and a ranch that required more than either of them could give individually. But it had held. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. That's my answer. He let out a breath. A slow one. The kind of breath a man releases when he has been holding something for longer than he realized. Good, he said. He said it the way he said things that mattered, plainly, without decoration. Good. As if the word was enough because the thing it represented was large enough not to need elaboration. She looked back at the west, at the last of the light. I'm still not Margaret, she said. I know that, he said, and I'll still tell you when I think you're wrong. I know that too, he said. There was something in his voice that was almost dry. I've noticed you're not shy about it. I'll try to be kind about it, she said. Mostly. Mostly is what I'd expect from you, he said. She laughed. It was small, not dramatic, but it was real. The kind of laugh that happens when something catches you off guard in the best possible way. He heard it and looked at her with the expression of a man who has discovered something valuable by accident and is now wondering how he managed without it. They sat on the front steps until the light was fully gone and the stars were out. Montana stars, which are a different proposition from stars in other places, more present, more serious. The sky so clear and dark that they seemed to be an argument about the scale of things. Evelyn appeared at the front door behind them. What are you doing? She said. Sitting, her father said. Just sitting? It's allowed, Eliza said. Evelyn considered this. Then she pushed open the door and sat down on Eliza's other side, pressing close in the way of a child who has decided this is her spot and is claiming it. They sat there, the three of them, while the stars did their patient work overhead. Ethan came out 10 minutes later, looked at the three of them on the steps, looked at the sky, and then sat down on his father's other side without comment, as if it was a thing he did every evening, as if sitting together in the cold and looking at the sky required no explanation. Nobody explained it. This is what people don't tell you about hard things. They do not resolve cleanly. They do not arrive at a moment where everything that was broken is whole and everything that was lost is returned. The grief does not finish. The damage does not reverse. The people you lost stay lost, and the years you spent in borrowed spaces and cold kitchens and provisional arrangements do not unhappen. What changes is smaller than that and more important. What changes is that you stop waiting. You stop waiting for the life you deserve to show up and replace the one you were actually living, and you start doing the work of the life in front of you with everything you have. And somewhere in that work, in the reorganized pantry shelf and the wrapped pump pipe, and the bowl of porridge made with brown sugar and dried apple, somewhere in the daily, undramatic, deeply necessary work of showing up, you find that the life you are living has become something you did not have to wait for. You built it. With your hands, your attention, your willingness to go back to the barn in the cold one more time, your refusal to stay broken when breaking was the easier option. Eliza Voss had come to Blackridge with a trunk and a pot, and $7, and a coat that needed mending at both elbows. She had been rejected publicly by a man who looked at her surface and saw only what was worn. She had been left on a platform in a storm with nowhere to go, and she had given her scarf to a cold child and walked into the wind and done the next necessary thing, and then the next, and then the next after that, until the things she had done accumulated into something that nobody could argue with and nobody could take away. Not Whitmore, with his bank connections and his land schemes and his careful, pressurized manipulation of other people's vulnerability. Not the women in good coats who reached for the convenient interpretation. Not 3 years of a family living in proximity to each other without really occupying the same world. None of it, in the end, could stand against the simple and devastating fact of a person who showed up and kept showing up and did the work with the full weight of everything she was. The stars were bright. The ranch was quiet. In the barn, a 3-week-old foal was learning the particular coordination of its own legs, which was going imperfectly and would continue going imperfectly for a while yet, which was exactly right. On the front steps of the ranch house, 4 people sat together in the dark. A man who had learned to open a door he'd held shut for 3 years, a boy who had remembered how to argue, a girl who had found somewhere to put her mother's things, and a woman who had stopped passing through places and started belonging to one. The night was cold. The stars did not care. The people on the steps were warm enough. That was the whole